When you know something important is happening, you want to be in there, to be part of it. At FT Live events, new ideas and valuable insights are shared by the world's leading minds, online and in person. Make sure you're there with them to shape the agenda and get the bigger picture. With the right people in the right place at the right time.
Welcome back to the first meeting of the FT's Global Affairs and Business Council. I'm Alex Russell, the FT's foreign editor. One quick question for you all. Who in the room has read the FT this morning? Excellent, thank you. There's some progress to make on that. The reason I ask is you will know that this is really quite a time to be hosting this event and launching this series, as I will explain. Earlier this year, it became very, very clear to me that the FT needed to launch a new series of events to try to make sense of this our rather turbulent world. The concept was clear. We'd bring together business leaders, policymakers, brain-busting thinkers, that's you lot, and we'd discuss the crises affecting the global economy. We'd also do some live journalism. Well, the need was also very clear. I think you'll agree. This was obvious even before Donald Trump's inauguration and very starkly clear afterwards. The old world order has been upended, as we know. There's the global trade war threatening disruption to markets. There's the total rethink of the old security order. And we knew that global business leaders and political leaders were thinking about this and having to adapt very quickly to these seismic shifts. There was one thing that was not clear, as I was explaining to our first speaker, Herr Klaus, earlier this morning. Where would we launch this project? So I'm going to briefly pull back the curtain on a touchy, sensitive debate at the FT a few months ago. So I was talking excitedly to senior colleagues about this idea, and some of them said, where will you start? So I didn't hesitate. I said, Berlin. There was a lot of, as we say in Britain, a lot of sucking of teeth, and everyone said, Berlin, yeah, but why not London? I mean, the headquarters of the Financial Times makes sense, doesn't it? Or New York, Wall Street, the FT. So I promise you, I didn't hesitate. I said Berlin. I said, we are a global news organization, and Berlin is having the most consequential, Germany rather, is having the most consequential event in Europe in 2025, outside the war in Ukraine. And a new government, when it comes in, will have a remarkable opportunity. Well, thank you, Germany. Thank you, Berlin. You've come up trumps, dare I say it. The election has been consequential. And today we will absolutely, among other things, explore what it means for Europe and the world. We have a terrific lineup of speakers, among others, Latvia's foreign minister. We've got Michael Klaus. We've got one of Ukraine's leading drone manufacturers, a remarkable figure and a remarkable entrepreneur, actually, as well. And we have, to close, Ambassador John Bolton, who I just think will be talking about what is going on in Trump's mind right now. On our mind is, as I said, the New World Order and how businesses and governments respond to it. There are risks, of course, but not least from the trade wars, but there are also opportunities. So before we get going on this, I would just like to thank our two global sponsors, They've made this possible, Alex Partners and ServiceNow, and also my many colleagues at the FT. Tiny bit of housekeeping. These sessions are on the record. They're being live streamed. Please do ask questions at the end. This is your opportunity to ask questions at the end of each session. We will allow plenty of time for that. Encourage colleagues to join our live stream, which can be found on YouTube and on the website. And I think now I'd like to welcome our first speaker onto the stage. I'm delighted to welcome Michael Klaus, who's been in post as the head of European policy for the new government for all of 5 or 6 weeks. And he is going to discuss with my terrific colleague Anne-Sylvaine Chassany, our Berlin bureau chief, a whole host of issues, but in particular the role of Germany in Europe and the New World Order. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Michael, ambassador. You're still ambassador to Brussels. I've just learned you have 2 jobs.
but just 1 salary.
I hope you complain to your boss. We really appreciate your time here, and you've just returned from G7, the G7 summit, and next week, NATO summit, EU Council, lots of things to sort, right?
Absolutely.
Including with Mr. Donald Trump. I mean, clearly, the action is in Berlin in Europe. It's been for a few months with this incredible shift in Germany in terms of fiscal policy. I mean, Friedrich Merz rather unexpectedly relaxed the debt brake and allowed himself a huge fiscal room for defense and infrastructure spending. And we are sensing a new tempo in Brussels, a new momentum. Can you maybe explain this shift? You were ambassador to Brussels since 2018, so quite a long time, and during a time where perhaps the German voice in Brussels was perhaps a bit difficult to hear or sometimes not there, not like absent. Can you tell us a bit how you experienced this shift and what it means for Europe?
Well, good morning to everybody, and well, congratulations on choosing Berlin for this event. Well, there is this famous or infamous German vote, which means that there's no agreement within the government, which automatically leads to us not being able to negotiate in Brussels. And when it comes to the final vote, it means abstaining. Abstaining is, as you know, is a polite no. It's like saying no, but in a more polite way, and that is not very constructive, and it really doesn't help, to move things on in Europe. And this, also in the previous government before the traffic light coalitions, there were moments where there was no agreement and where the German voice was quite muted. But I never experienced a situation like we had in the last, I would say, 1 or 2 years, where kind of it really became, such a problem that also colleagues came to me and said, what's going on? We want to see German leadership, especially in these times of geopolitical challenges, geopolitical upheaval. We want Germany to be present, to assume its responsibility, and to show leadership. And there was a lack of it. And this is the intention of this government, especially Friedrich Merz, to do a kind of a reset in European affairs, and for Germany to be back on the European stage and assume a leadership role commensurable, with our economic size and also size of this country.
So you're talking about a reset.
Being the biggest country.
Yes, indeed. And so this reset, you probably heard the cries of joy out of Paris that, finally Germany was going to spend a little bit and stimulate its economy. Is it becoming a bit French, perhaps?
Well, it's not so much about, putting state aid. I think the previous government, did this in very different dimensions. So this is about tax breaks, but it's true. It's about restarting the economy, and it's first of all, it's about cutting red tape, fighting overregulation. This has really gone too far. We know from business that it has really become an impediment, an obstacle to investments. That is also very much a priority for the Chancellor and for this government.
And so this reset with France, I mean, there was a lot of tensions around energy. What can you tell us about this reset? I know the French side is very excited about Merz. We know his views about nuclear power, and this question, it's a very ideological question in Europe, had kind of poisoned the relationship and the rest of Europe.
Mm. I mean, you could see even less than having been in office for 24 hours. Friedrich Merz traveled to Paris. I think there was a clear signal that this is a reset also in the Franco-German relationship in the afternoon. Then he traveled on to Poland. But first was Paris. And then there had been a lot of discussions. And there had been also meetings before Merz took office between him and Macron, where they try to see a little bit of how to solve the differences that we have. And you just mentioned nuclear, so this has been, in fact, being a quite toxic issue between Berlin and Paris, because, it pops up time and again, even when kind of every week it was on the agenda of COREPER, for example, even when you prepare third country summits and a joint declaration, the issue pops up. So it has been really a problem. And I think the signal that Merz was giving is we try to settle these differences. And, it doesn't mean necessarily that we will return to nuclear power. That is still under discussion in this government. But that we accept and respect that other countries have different choices. And if I look at the situation in Europe, there's hardly any country left that opposes nuclear power.
Right, and so it's true that Germany is to stimulate its economy and to really give it a boost, is going to subsidize energy prices. It's going to incentivize the gas-powered station capacity. This requires some tough discussions with the Commission on state aid. There's going to be also probably a discussion on the deficit and debt. How are you? I mean, has Europe lost the guardian of fiscal rules?
Well, I mean, until very recently, we have been criticized time and again for not doing investments into infrastructure, into our armed forces, into the military. Now we do it. Now we have a little bit the opposite discussion, saying, hey, but where's the level playing field? Yes. And should Germany really do it? And what about the fiscal rules? Yeah. So I think we very much believe that what we intend to do, to really put in a lot of more money into military, but also infrastructure, and I mean, you drive around the country, you see it's really needed badly. So what we get from the Commission, and we believe that too, is that it will be possible to do it according and in line with the fiscal rules, that we have just overhauled and that we have reformed the Stability and Growth Pact. And we are quite convinced that it does give sufficient flexibility to us to do exactly what we intend to do.
And you think
and you have maybe also heard Commissioner Dombrovskis saying basically the same.
Yes, very well. I mean, there's a lot of goodwill in Brussels towards Germany at the moment, and the French can also help, right? I mean, being allies, I guess, on this subject, it's going to help, right? Okay. So I want to talk about, and I know the time is already running out, I want to talk about trade, because it's so important for the German economy, and there's this trade dispute with Donald Trump in the context of a more difficult relationship with the US. What can you tell us in terms of a possible deal with the U.S. administration. We know that Trump really wants a headline. He wants tariff. He wants to keep, and he actually needs it for his big, beautiful bill, I think. And so, how's Germany's view things, and how do you think the EU is going to deal with it, so to get a deal before the 9th of July?
Well, first let me say that we believe that trade between us, the European Union and the United States, is pretty much balanced. It's true that the balance is in the Europeans, the EU's favor when it comes to industrial goods, but when it comes to services, it's just the other way around. So now we are being faced with these 10% tariffs, the so-called reciprocal tariffs, and then there's the sectoral tariffs on cars. There might be more to follow on pharmaceuticals. I think they haven't made up their mind yet in Washington over exactly what they're going to do about this. And well, you know that the European Commission is in the lead. All the competences are basically with the Commission. And the Commission has now put forward a substantial offer, so they're really negotiating. There was meetings in the margins of the Kananaskis summit between Šefčovič and USTR Greer. So it's going on. Later on, he traveled to Washington, so we're really trying to get the deal done. But as I said, I mean, we've been doing the EU side substantial offers that have not been reciprocated, at least to my knowledge, 2 days ago by the US side.
Right, and
so we're waiting for that. So it always takes two to tango.
Right, and Friedrich Merz has mentioned a deal when he went to see Donald Trump about cars, some sort of export credits or some sort of waivers on a certain amount of cars imported and exported. Is that the type of things that we're looking into?
Well, there's different things. So it's true. There's also discussions going on about these offsets, the car credits that might be part of the overall deal, or the overall solution. But we're also discussing tariff lines. I think the Commission offered to talk about something like made offers on more than 1,000 tariff lines. And also there's discussions going on about quotas and also about what the US calls non-tariff trade barriers, though here we don't see eye to eye. I mean, saying that VAT is a non-tariff trade barrier for us sounds a little bit bizarre, to put it in diplomatic terms. But this is kind of a part of the conversation, and then we'll really have to see. So now it becomes a little bit more clear. We see also what is the focus on the US, and I understand that first they want to see a little bit where is the landing zone on the so-called reciprocal tariffs, so the 10%, in order then to move on to the other tariffs, the sectoral tariffs, and that for us, I mean, seeing the huge importance of the car industry for Europe, but especially for us, that is something that is very much in our mind.
Yeah, and do you think that maybe some of the tariffs that the EU was going to implement mid-July could be delayed, for example?
Well, we'll have to see. So I think we kind of have what they call truce until July 9th. Yeah. And we'll have to see how far we get. It maybe doesn't need to be, a kind of a very detailed agreement, but kind of, more of a declaration saying, okay, this is, a little bit along the model of the US-UK trade deal. So it could be a little bit like this, that you kind of have a more, about agreeing on principles and saying this is the way forward, and we need to still work a little bit on the details here and there. So It's doable, but if it's going to happen, I think it's too early to tell.
Okay, just wanted to talk a little bit about security and defense. Obviously, Germany is now has the margins to really ramp up its spending in the military, but
at least in theory, it's unlimited.
Unlimited, and we're talking about numbers of 500 billion over the next decade, but some other countries can't really do it. Can't really keep up, including France is fiscally very constrained.
Yes.
So, how do we? I mean, in the context of a possible withdrawal of the U.S. posture or reduction of the U.S. posture in Europe, how do we make sure that everybody's kind of able to ramp up? I'm going to ask about joint borrowing, for example, at EU level. What do you think?
I mean, as a principal rule, I think every member state has to pay for its own national defense expenditures as a rule. And then we know that there's difficulties. Some countries are highly indebted, so that for them it's a much bigger burden. That's why we have this permanent, I would say, discussion about joint borrowing. There was never any Coreper meeting, I recall, in the last, I don't know, 12 months or so without, mentioning either Eurobonds or kind of, or just saying innovative ideas or joint borrowing or next generation EU 2.0.
Yeah.
And here our position has not really changed. But still, I mean, we need to address the issue. And that's why the Commission came forward with this proposal, which is called the SAFE program, which is basically loans for loans, not loans for grants. Loans for loans, for us is okay, we support it.
Right.
And this is 150 billion. We understand that quite a few member states will make use of it, probably including France. I'm not sure if the final decision has been taken. So that will help. And then when it comes to having more European money available for defense, I think then that will be in the context of the discussion on the next multi-annual financial framework. Here, as you know, the Commission is going to present a proposal early next month, and in that context, we'll have to see, I mean, how much, funding we will provide in the budget in future for financing defense expenditure.
Financing. And in terms of defense and this reset with France, I mean, France has been really keen on this concept of strategic autonomy. We know that Friedrich Merz is also very attached to the transatlantic relationship. How far is he willing to go to meet Macron's, mind and views on that? Buying European, buying American.
Well, what exactly does strategic autonomy mean? I mean, how far are we going to go? I mean, that we have to become, that we have to do much more, and carry a much bigger part of the burden. I think that is well understood by everybody. Right. But does it mean that we will be completely independent European defense? I think this is not going to happen, at least not in the next couple of years, because we lack what they call the enablers, the military integrated structure that NATO has. Yes. There is no, without the US, there is no really credible nuclear deterrence, for all the EU member states, including the Baltic countries and all of it. So the US is going to remain indispensable. At the same time, I mean, and here we see eye to eye with the French, we need to do much more, and we need to increase also European production. We need to increase, decrease our dependency on US arms, so there needs to be a much more important production of armaments here in the European Union. Okay. And this is we have there was just an agreement on what's called this EDIP program,
Yeah.
and this is also what SAFE, this 150 billion loans for loans, is designed to do to help foster European production.
And actually, for these two programs, I mean, the question of the UK, as you know, in the security framework of Europe, so Macron is probably a bit more reluctant to let the UK participate. What's the view in Berlin?
Well, we do have quite a few armament programs, joint projects with the United Kingdom, like Italy and others. So there's a very large majority inside the European Union which wants the UK to be, participating in a very intense and close way. And this is also why we agreed on this, what is called this strategic and defense program, I think.
Treaty,
Treaty. So that was agreed at the EU-UK summit, and it kind of opens the door to UK participation. And I think when we talk about the defense of Europe in general, difficult to see that it would be without the United Kingdom.
Right. Yeah.
Being the other nuclear power and also having a pretty good military and a very competitive arms industry.
I want to talk about Ukraine and what the EU can do in terms of supporting Ukraine. There is a package of sanctions, I think that's supposed to be agreed on next week. Are you confident that this is going to be agreed, and this new package of sanctions against Russia?
Yes, well, it's called the 18th sanction package. It's quite substantial.
Yeah.
I can see that in the discussions in Coreper and Brussels that there's a great deal of consensus. So I would expect that to be agreed and adopted early next week, even before the European Summit, the European Council, taking place exactly in a week's time. Hungary
is on board, I mean?
Yes.
Ah, right, okay.
So, but I know that, when it comes to these sanction packages, people always ask, so is Hungary being very complicated? And in fact, usually they're never the last ones to come on board. Huh?
Okay,
so if they see that certain red lines are observed, there has never been any real issue, and I don't recall that they have been blocking in the last 1.5 years. So.
Okay, and so in this package,
we now have a Slovak issue. I think that still needs to be discussed. But I can't see that in the end they will block. So I think this has a little bit to do with the cutting oil and gas imports from Russia, and that is an issue I think the Slovaks want to raise. But I cannot see that there's a fundamental issue on blocking the 18th sanction package. Right. I mean, as we are all aware, adopting a package is still under unanimity.
No. Okay, in this package of sanctions, there's sanctions against Nord Stream, and this big gas pipeline, so controversial in Germany and in Europe, linking Russia and Germany. Can you tell us if Germany was really pushing for it and why?
But how should I put it?
Pushing for the sanctions.
Well, I think that it was clear from the beginning there was a consensus in this government that it was acceptable, not only acceptable, but that we wanted it, and we let the Commission and others know that we'd be happy to have sanctions on Nord Stream 1 and 2.
Right, and you were
just to give a clear signal to the Russians, because there had been discussions on rehabilitating Nord Stream and all of this, and just to put an end to that discussion, I think we're quite comfortable with making clear that's not going to happen.
And that's a political risk in Germany, I bet, because I mean there is a debate still in Germany, so it's kind of. Ending the debate here, okay.
Yeah, but there was not much of a debate in the government, so I think the government sees eye to eye and inside the government, and that was pretty clear.
Okay, and is this package of sanctions going to be really effective without a US package of sanctions? And how confident are you that there will be one?
Well, what we don't know, I mean, we still see that a U.S. package of sanctions is still under discussion. Lindsey Graham has been presenting some ideas. I think it's even gone quite far, which is very substantial.
Yeah.
But we don't know. So if a final decision will be taken in the next couple of days, and if it's going to be a decision that will be basically up to President Trump. In case that the US would not come with the sanction package, so would our sanctions be effective when it comes to sanctioning Nord Stream 1 and 2? Yes. When it comes to combating shadow fleet? Yes. When it comes to de-swifting Russian banks? Yes. When it comes to the oil price cap,
Right.
I would have doubts. So if that would be really effective without the US participating in it.
Right. Okay.
But the rest, I guess, yes. Basically, yes.
Yes. Okay. Right. I just. I mean, there are other questions, but I think we want to open up to the room. To if anyone wants to ask a question, yes, please, and please, can you also introduce yourself?
You have the mic now.
I think there's another one.
Okay.
Thanks. Christian Schubert, BASF Chemical Company. Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for the insights. Can you enlighten us a little bit and manage our expectations in regard to the upcoming EU-China summit end of July? Unlike it was previously planned, the Chinese leadership is not coming here. The European leadership is going to China. Can you tell us a little bit what to expect in terms of outcome of this summit?
Well, as you know, it's an institutional summit, so it's not the 27 member states participating. That's why it's probably also easier to travel to China. I mean, know that if Xi Jinping is going to be involved, so I think the Chinese, said, well, if you do it in Brussels, it's going to be the prime minister. If you want the party boss and president to participate, and probably it's going to be in China, which is absolutely fine with us. So what are they going to discuss? We're probably also, I mean, there's a trade issue. We have trade frictions with China. And let's see how far we get. I mean, there's some long-standing issues that we have been discussing. When I went to China as ambassador in 2013, there was already all these discussions about level playing field and so. That hasn't changed because the situation has not improved, as all of us are aware. It's going to be part of the conversation. Then I'm sure that the issue of tariffs on Chinese electric cars will come up. There's going to be, public procurement and investments and all of it. I'm not sure that we will see a breakthrough. I can't see that China is going to change its economic model, so that means there's going to be limits on what is doable. I mean, Chinese have been fairly consistent in their economic policy, which leads to overproduction, which has become a problem for us. If you just look at the trade balance, I mean, it's very much in China's favor and to our disadvantage. I can't see that the Chinese are really, I would not expect the Chinese really to move on that.
On China, actually, a follow-up question on tariffs and cars. Germany was quite opposed to this tariff. Is there a shift in terms of policy? And it's a vital. China is a vital market for companies, but also it's very damaging. The competition in Germany is very damaging to industries like car manufacturing and steel.
I mean, I haven't heard much of a discussion, and I think that fears have died down a little bit. So about a year ago, it was a really big issue, and there was a concern that China might retaliate and put 100% tariffs on cars imported from Germany. The big luxury cars, which would have a quite dramatic effect. In fact, nothing much happened. I think the fears were overblown, and I can't see that the Chinese are really, intent on saying, okay, but now the moment has come. So I think the fears were probably a bit overblown.
Okay. Any other questions? Yes, please. Here. A microphone.
Hi, I'm Stefan Marx of DWS, the asset manager. You said that Germany wants to be restored to its proper role in the EU as a leading nation, but one problem that has always dogged the kind of German stance in Europe was the German vote. And obviously that's been quite a big problem in the previous coalition. So how do you want to make sure that the German vote doesn't persist again, given that the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats cannot agree on quite a lot of things?
Well, I mean, it started pretty well. I remember that in my first couple of days in my kind of new capacity, so I had to, see a little bit, have some phone calls because there was a risk of a German vote, but then I could see there was a readiness on both sides. Well, basically, it's even three parties forming that coalition. But to see that there's no German vote, so that we come to a clear decision. It's either going to be yes or it's going to be a no. I mean, we're only in week 6, but on several occasions I've seen that there's a really great willingness on all sides to see that Germany is effective, that we are able to participate in negotiations, that there's going to be no more a German vote. We will never see a German vote again, I doubt, but then it's going to be, I guess, it will be limited to very few cases. So I think we're really back, and if you also look at the structure of the government, so the two coordinating ministries are of the same political party as the chancellor, and we're trying now also to see that we strengthen European coordination, European policy coordination. There was also some internal reforms. We have this so-called, I don't know how to translate that into English, before a cabinet meeting, you have the deputy ministers meeting. And here you have a new agenda item, which is EU monitoring, where we try to settle differences between ministries and between the two parties. So in order to be, able to have a position in time before really negotiations start. So far it has been going quite well.
Actually, a follow-up question from me on this. The Social Democrats in Europe have been quite critical of the Commission's proposal from the Draghi report. Is that going to be a problem for your partner here, for the SPD here, and what Merz wants to push in terms of reform agenda, his reform agenda in Europe?
You're referring to this issue of cutting red tape, simplification?
Yes, simplification and competitive compass. Which I think the Social Democrats have been quite critical in European Parliament.
Well, that mustn't necessarily translate into differences inside the government. Right. Sometimes, the viewpoint from Brussels, even if it's kind of the same party, and that goes for all parties, might be a little bit different. So far, I'm not aware of that there's some massive differences, and also on an issue that is politically not so easy, about simplification. When we talk about cutting red tape, does that mean also deregulation or not? So in some parts of the government you would rather say, okay, we want to reduce the reporting burden, but not to deregulate. Other parts of the government say yes, but in reality, I mean, if you look at the different topics, it's a bit difficult to see. I mean, how far does simplification go and where does deregulation start? So it's probably a little bit both. And here, like in the government here, also in Brussels, you will have to find some way in the Council and later on in European Parliament.
Other questions? Other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. Dennis Barron from the DHL Group. Given the increasing calls for an independent strategic autonomy in defense policy and economy policy for the EU, how do you see Germany's role as a balancing factor in supporting these calls on the one hand, and on the other side, improving or maybe maintaining good relationship in the transatlantic perspective of all those fields?
I mean, So U.S. is for the foreseeable future, I think is indispensable for the security of Europe and the military defense of Europe. As I said, I mean, because we lack the enablers, so-called, satellite systems, reconnaissance, air transport, and other things. At the same time, I mean, there's this issue about the credible nuclear deterrence. So this is trying to keep the U.S. As close as possible to us and engaged. And we're quite happy that when Merz asked Trump, I mean, if they intend to stay here, the answer was pretty clear. Yes, definitely. There's no doubt about it. And at the same time, I think, and that we have seen now actually ever since the US did this pivot to Asia, which started, I think, in the Obama administration in 2010 or so, that the US expects us to carry a much bigger part of the burden, which goes kind of also into the direction of what the French call maybe more strategic autonomy. So I think it's compatible, doing both, because U.S. clearly expects us to do more, and this is also why this government pretty early on decided to support this call for 5% defense increase expenditures.
How is the rapport?
And it has been, been very well received by the U.S.
Okay, and how's the rapport between Mr. Merz and Donald Trump? Can you give us a flavor?
Well, I could see that also in Kananaskis at the G7. So I think they have a good working relationship. So they get along well with each other, and it might also be, because there's some things they share, like both have somewhat of a business background. Both, tend to be sometimes outspoken, not neglecting the differences that we have on some issues, but. I think it's quite respectful and a good relationship for working with each other. Yeah?
There was a question here.
Morning, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. If you allow me first a comment and then I ask my question. One comment was just. There's a bit an oxymoron from some of the comments from the government in regards to no to nuclear power and then yes to nuclear weapons. I think that needs to be clarified. But the question actually was on SWIFT. Don't you think the law of unintended consequences, if we were to get the SWIFT system, basically Russia off it, would it not allow Russia then with China and the other BRICS states to create an alternative? And would we then not actually lose power in that?
Well, yes, you're right. I remember having had a discussion also with the CEO of SWIFT, that SWIFT is based in Brussels, not far from EU headquarters. And yes, I mean, there's a point in that. On the other hand, if we really want to squeeze the Russians economically, we have to do it. So it's a little bit, I understand there's that discussion all the time, and this is why we have been also hesitant and not de-swifted all Russian banks, on kind of a day one, exactly because of that. So we are very well aware of that, and it's always kind of, you will have to choose a little bit, but so we are progressing, and there's more de-swifting, and there's also transactional bans and so going on. But at the same time, I think we're all aware that also some channels need to be kept open because we still have companies engaged in European companies engaged in Russia who can't pull out.
Yeah. Indeed. More questions? We can take. Yeah, we can take one.
Thank you. Thank you. Johannes Bauer with the American Gas Partners. I mean, I think it's now very clear due to the tweet of Mr. Jürgensen that the EU is now adamant to phase out Russian gas. We all know that there are still quite some volumes coming in from Russia into the EU as we speak. So what is the plan to replace Russian gas with from the EU Commission? And at the same time, one may argue that the phase out of Russian gas may increase gas prices even still. And at the same time, especially in Germany, the primary industry is burdened by the decarbonization and net zero policies, which also increase the input prices. So you cannot really bolster defenses without primary industry, which is silently dying here in Germany. So what are you going to do to save steel, chemical, and all the other ingredients we need for, rearm Europe and Germany?
Well, I guess you're referring to this negotiations that we're having, or the, I think it's not been presented by the Commission yet, this repower package, which means wean yourself off from Russian gas and oil. On oil, I think it's not very important anymore. I think 3% of the oil being consumed in the European Union comes from Russia, so that is not so important for the EU altogether. But for some countries it is, landlocked countries who have a problem, and that we just referred to Slovakia and also to Hungary. And on the LNG, we'll see. So when we get, let's see what the proposal is going to look like. I mean, we are very well aware of that we would have to do it in such a way that it doesn't lead to a massive price hike on LNG, because already energy prices are way too high. But that is a discussion that we'll be having once the Commission proposal is out, and I know that they're also aware of it, and I think all of us have made clear whatever we do, it must not lead and cannot lead to a price hike.
I think, I mean, I'd like to ask you a personal question, perhaps to Anne. As a German diplomat, your career, nearly 40 years. In being a German diplomat, how do you experience this shift, this rearmament of Germany, and this moment?
Well, just a very personal view. I think it's long overdue, and we're surprised that we didn't start. Should have started latest, probably 2014. I think from 2014 on, there shouldn't have been any illusions anymore about who Putin is and about kind of the imperial nature of the Russian regime. And we should have started way earlier, but it's, never too late to start, so I'm happy it's starting, and that we begin with it. And this is also what I call, it's really assuming responsibility. And I think it's a big step for Germany. It's a big move. And you also know that there's discussions in the country. Not everybody is happy. There's been criticism, but the government is pretty united on this one. And I'm happy to see it really happening. And here, this is also what I would say is where Germany now will lead by example and show leadership.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for your time. We really appreciate it. I know it's really busy. Thank you.
Great pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you both. Thank you, Michael, for absolutely reassuring me that it was the right thing that we came to Berlin. We look forward to seeing what happens now, but a fascinating conversation on so many fronts, so thank you. We are turning speedily and effortlessly on to the next session now, the small matter of the defense of Europe and the future of NATO, questions that have been very much to the fore since that terrible day in February 2022. I would like to welcome onto the stage my colleague Henry Foy, our Brussels Bureau Chief, who leads our coverage on these matters, and his three terrific panelists. Very good timing for this conversation, Henry, just ahead of the NATO's summit. So yes, just two simple questions: how to rethink NATO and the defense of Europe. Thank you.
Good morning. This is working. Good morning. My name is Henry Foy, as Alec has just introduced. These are my brilliant guests. If you sit down, Claudia will put you here. Yes, thank you very much for coming and for listening. We're going to talk about how to rethink NATO, defense of Europe. I'm joined by Braja, the Foreign Minister of Latvia, and a very dear friend. Thank you so much. Dr. Norbert Röttgen, who is the Deputy Chair of the CDU-CSU Parliamentary Group, and Claudia Major, who is the Senior Vice President for Transatlantic Security at the German Marshall Fund. Bye-bye, I wanted to start with you. We've just had G7, we're going to have NATO in a few days. You've just spent a lot of time with Matthew Whitaker, Trump's ambassador to NATO. He came to visit. Tell us, do you feel that US support for Europe is still rock solid, or do we need to come up with an alternative plan?
I think US support for US is really rock solid, and that involves, of course, NATO. So that is a model of cooperation that has been successful for 76 years, and it has formed such bonds among the military in the first place, among the intel agencies, among defense industries. I mean, it's everything. It's a huge success for all of us. So political leadership comes in at a certain moment to sort of not to spoil things, and that is a low KPI to have. So with President Trump clearly putting it out there that everybody has to contribute to the defense in a significant way, I think that is fully supported by us and by a number of others, and that is what is happening. So we praise German leadership in this, and look forward to a successful summit. We are not there yet,
Yeah.
But yeah, discussions are.
I understand from talking to some of your colleagues and other officials in Brussels that there's this semi-schizophrenic approach. It's like we keep the Americans as close as possible and say everything is all right, but in the background work on a plan B. Is that how you'd characterize it?
I don't know what you mean with schizophrenic approach, but we always, as diplomats, have a plan B. So that's, the way what we are paid for. It's not
Fine. So, prepare for the...
Don't jump from a skyscraper and then say, oh, didn't happen.
No. Dr. Röttgen, I wanted to turn to Germany. I mean, firstly, does Germany share Biber and Latvia's confidence in the Americans sticking around for a long time? And obviously Germany will play a massive role in whatever comes next. Are you confident that Germany is going to hit these targets, is going to do enough and keep things together if the US were to step back?
No, we have to. And what we are seeing is that, and this is a change I think we can't and shouldn't deny, I think there is a new definition of American interests. I would say it's not new that American foreign policy and American European policy is led by interest, by values, but I would say has always been led by interests.
Sure.
And what was the defining interest since America entered the Second World War was that they came to the conclusion European security is a genuine American interest. And this has been the definition of American interest regarding Europe for 80 years. And I would say that has changed. And it would have changed even if Kamala Harris would have been elected. It would have been communicated to us in a more friendly way and perhaps in less a tempo. But this is a new reality, and this has reasons. America is overstretched. So Europe is overdue in assuming more duties, responsibility for our own security. This is a new reality. And it took very long for the Europeans, the Germans particularly, to understand this new reality. And now I would say we have understood the new reality and we are acting accordingly.
And that's understood here in Berlin, you think, but also across the rest of the 30 other non-US allies in NATO? Or do you think it's still sinking in with others?
No, I would say the Central and Eastern and Northern European countries and governments have understood this for quite a time.
Yeah.
And I would say particularly Germany has been very reluctant in really internalizing what this means. Yeah. What I would really like to add is that there has been a fundamental shift in the public view on security, on defense, and that it matters after the Russian war against Ukraine. So for now 3.5 years, there has been undeniably a fundamental shift. So we were, I would say, quite a pacifist country.
and all the political talk was about, of course, rightly so, dialogue and all these détente and all these things, but never really about defense and deterrence as a part of diplomacy. And this has changed. And then I would say there was a great speech of Olaf Scholz a few days after the invasion, but then there was there was a lack of implementation of this speech, and I would say now we are going to start the phase of serious implementation.
Thank you so much. Claudia, do you think that what you've just heard is true, or do you think they're sort of putting, as we say in Britain, putting lipstick on a pig?
That's a nice first question.
To improve our relationship.
To improve our relationship.
Okay, Claudia.
Yes, I think it's true. I would nuance it a little bit. I think that the threat perception, the level of concernedness, is different in Europe. And the further you move away from Russia, and the less you have bad historical experience with Russia, the less you feel concerned.
Yep.
The Baltic countries, like Biber's country, Russia has took them off the map. They lost independence. So there's no illusion about Russia. Seen from Portugal, this is far away. Yeah. So the threat perception, the level of concernedness in Europe is totally different. And I think it's really important to understand what happened in Germany, and Norbert explained that perfectly. I would add a little dimension. For a very long time, since unification, Germany did security policy out of solidarity. Germany didn't feel militarily threatened. We felt threatened from many things: climate change, migration, economy not doing as well as we would like to see it. Yeah. But there was no military threat perception. So Germany went to Afghanistan because we wanted to be the best ally with the US. We went to Mali because we're like this with the French, so we go there. And we went with the EFP, with NATO troops, to the Baltic countries because we always wanted to be the advocate of the smaller countries. Sure. That it wasn't really a security threat. And what changed with the renewed invasion in 2022 is that for the Germans, it was perceived like this is about us. Yeah. So it's not longer about being a nice ally, behaving well, but it was about, oh, there's really somebody threatening our way of doing things in a military way, waging war, which we are not used to. And that was the level of concernedness that changed in 2022. But then came what Norbert described, this kind of, oh, the Ukrainians managed to kick the Russians back to Donbass. This is still dangerous, but it's a bit less about us. So the whole challenge is to keeping that moment going, having the implementation, and keeping that sense of urgency. And what the new government did, last sentences, is not making in defense yet another special budget for 4 years, limited in time, limited in scope. But the government said, this is urgent. We change our constitution in 2 weeks. Germans don't change their constitution quickly and not lightly. We did it in 2 weeks. The outgoing parliament, the new government. And this underlines the urgency, and it says every defense spending above 1% is exempt from the debt brake, and our defense spending is guided by military needs and NATO defense planning. For a nerd like me, this is pure beauty. So it is about what we need. And this is, for me, the incarnation of they finally got it.
Yeah.
But implementation, that's as we all know, it's always good in January to have good ideas for the next years, but then you have to implement.
I want to come back to implementation, but on that point, we know what we need to do. Don't we also need to know what the Americans plan? And isn't there a missing part of this puzzle that we don't know where the Americans are going to pull assets and at what speed? And until we know that, how can we invest in the capabilities in the right order? Is that coming clearer when you talk to your American colleagues?
Listen, the way we work together is that first there is a regular joint threat assessment.
Yep.
All our military, civilian intelligence agencies put their minds, information, intel together and literally go through it and then define the commonality. And there are those who might disagree and this and that. On Russia, it was unanimous. And it's still unanimous. Russia is the most direct and significant threat to Euro-Atlantic security and allies' security. And terrorism is the most significant asymmetric threat to the citizens of the alliance. Right. Okay. So the military planning takes place on the basis of those threats.
Right.
So in Russian case, it's against Russia's capabilities of 2021. That's when the defense plans were developed. So there are particular Russian capabilities that were theirs that everybody in NATO sort of knows. Our military leaders, through integrated military planning, developed the plans, force structure, new authorities for the highest military commander, US secure in Europe, and fulfilling all those is what is taking place currently. And that's why we need the defense spending. It's not because a percentage that, US president or administration has said. It's actually based on the military assessment that there are those capabilities that we need. In our case, for example, the spending, NATO's definition, doesn't include conscription.
Right.
Neither in Finnish case. So we spend much further, we spend much more than actually we say we spend at NATO, because the real expenses are further beyond. That also includes the external border of the EU and NATO that we are guarding.
Of course.
Both military, civilian structures, customs, everything else that we have. So it's a lot of money going into it, which has an effect on the economy. Because it's not like you get directly reinvestment from all that you spend on defense spending. But that is something within NATO, the collective sort of deterrence that has worked for 76 years, and why German businesses can rely on, okay, we can invest in the future here, there, and elsewhere. Or, we know quite clearly, okay, changes that take place here in terms of taxes and so on and so forth. We don't doubt that security and defense is there. But that is through this very complex and through this very integrated process that we do in NATO.
So absolutely right that the 5% number is not just picked out of the air by Trump, and it does.
Russia sets the percent. Russia sets the tempo. Russia sets the reconstitution. It's just, let's accept that.
My question is, that 5% also assumes America keeps its constant presence in Europe, right? If America were to pull back, as Trump has suggested they might, that number could rise higher still.
So what happened during the first Trump administration? Actually, there was more troops moved to Europe. There was more money spent in Europe, even though the rhetorics were different. And because that was the military need.
Sure.
That was the need that was there. And throughout President Biden's administration, that was also happening due to the threats that we faced, all of us. Today we have more US troops in Europe again for different reasons. There's massive exercising taking place, including in the Baltics. There's the integrated nuclear exercise being prepared. There's the preparations for Russian Zapad exercise, where it's not going to be massive, but still we take it very seriously. And there is the Middle East, where the US has moved quite significant amounts of air capabilities to Europe. The global posture reviews that US is conducting, every new administration does it, especially if it comes from the other side of the aisle. And there are givens that we know that are there. Because it's, again, nothing new to say that for the US, China is such a challenge that they take it very seriously. And the difference with a few years ago is actually that China will much faster reach its nuclear balance warheads with US and Russia. China is not being transparent. China is not cooperating on verification or anything. There is no treaties guiding relationships in that respect. Biggest navy, other conventional forces, space capability. I mean, aircraft carriers, which is a force projection capability. It's not a defensive capability, and so on and so forth. So those realities for the US are as present as for our partners in Indo-Pacific. But the message, I was there with Secretary Hegseth in Singapore, in Shangri-La Forum. His message to partners in Indo-Pacific was exactly the same as for Europeans. Don't think that the US will be able just to save you. You need to invest yourselves. You need to invest in defense. You need to invest in capabilities. You need to collaborate and figure out what is important for your region. Yes, US will work with you, but it's not US alone there.
So everyone's getting a bill.
Absolutely.
Okay. Norbert, you talked about implementation and the example of the Scholz speech, which sort of then petered out a bit. How do we make sure that this new Merz defense bazooka doesn't go along the same lines, and then scale that up to the entirety of Europe, all spending 5%.
Yeah.
Implementation is really key here, and there's never really been another example of how we make sure it's all coordinated.
Yeah.
Is that a concern for you?
No, it's of course we will have. Of course, there will be debates, and there is perhaps maybe degrees of levels of determination.
Sure.
However, I would say it's beyond doubt that the new government shares a common and new determination. I would say, if I would reduce this coalition to one element, if I could only pick one, then I would say there is a common sense. It's upon us, in an unprecedented way, us, Germany, that we have to contribute to European security. So this is absolutely clear. Of course, the parties are a little bit different, and they have different debates internally.
Sure.
But the government is determined. Claudia already mentioned this. This is really, I would say, also it has been unprecedented in the 2 weeks' time, and for this. And for the CDU, the debt brake was introduced in the German constitution after the big financial international crisis. And as a result, by the way, now we have a debt GDP ratio of slightly above 60%.
Yeah.
So there is fiscal capacity left.
Well, it's the only fiscal capacity left in Europe.
Unfortunately, you are right with this assessment, and this is part of a problem, I have to say.
Yeah.
Yes. However, it is there. And this constitutional change indicates or gave evidence to our determination to make use of it.
Can I ask you about the night that Chancellor Merz won? He made a quite extraordinary remark about Germany being independent of the US. And then sort of in the weeks that followed, sort of rolled that back a little bit. Could you sort of characterize why that rollback took place? Do you think he realized he'd gone too far, or do you think he heard supportive noises from the Americans?
So it's a, how should I phrase it? So I fully agree with the statements a few days later than the midnight euphoria.
Okay.
And I would say I think we have now found a right balance. We have to do the main share of conventional defense in Europe.
Sure.
And there are elements we could not substitute of American power in Europe. We do not want to substitute because our core interest has remained to keep the Americans in Europe. And this is how it's going to work. And I would say now the view is absolutely clear, and the policy as well.
They might need to update that old NATO quote about keeping the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down, though. So.
Yes, I would say the last element we've
got to change that.
Slightly adapt.
Claudia, I wanted to ask you about a specific example of Europe-US reshuffling, which is the coalition of the willing in Ukraine. You've written about this recently. I mean, if you were to assess that as a kind of blueprint of what the future might look like, it's not particularly rosy, is it?
On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, not. Starting with a positive element, after the Munich Security Conference, or at the Munich Security Conference, the Americans made very clear that if there were to be a ceasefire in Ukraine, it were up to the Europeans to secure it.
Absolutely.
So the Americans would be out, it's your problem, you do it. And in order to show that the Europeans are up to it, the French and the British teamed up in that coalition of the willing and said, we can do it, we show it. And then you had a really amazing meeting with them in Berlin, London, in Paris, London, and really frequent. And you had the CHOTs, so the military chiefs meeting, even going to Ukraine. So lots of activity.
Well, lots of talking.
Let me finish.
Okay.
So on the one hand, there was this quick stepping up. We do this, we get NATO on board, we get the EU on board. And what I liked in this format is that Europe was able to overcome our institutional pillars.
Yeah.
Normally, we say we have a problem, it's EU or it's NATO.
Yeah.
And it's not helpful. So to say, we take the countries who are willing and able, let them address it in a flexible framework. This is good. The more negative point is that you have in this coalition of the willing, simply speaking, 3 baskets. It's regeneration of forces, training Ukrainian forces.
Yeah.
It's industrial cooperation, and the third is the military, like having boots on the ground and that. And in the first two baskets, regeneration of forces, industrial cooperation, that's fine. But we only talk about the third one. We only talk about boots on the ground.
Yeah.
And this is where most European countries very quickly said, if you don't have American backstop, if you don't have American intelligence targeting long-range fires and missile support, and if you don't know if something happens in Ukraine, they will help us, we will not properly not do it. They don't really say no, they say probably not.
Yeah.
Because their own national defense is at stake. I talked to many colleagues in Europe in December, January, and they said, yeah, we can do this. That should be fine. And I talked again to them in March and April, and they were like, maybe not, because before Trump's election, we were sure if we would kind of empty our defense, the Americans would save us. We can send troops to Ukraine, but we can't do that anymore. If you look to come back to what Biber said, the NATO defense planning clearly says where has to be where in Europe in order to defend NATO territory in case of a Russian aggression. So all NATO troops or German, Latvian, Estonian troops are in this defense planning.
Yeah.
They are locked in. So if we want to put troops somewhere, say in Ukraine, we have to take them out of the NATO planning. So we have to consciously weaken our defense in order to support Ukraine.
Yeah.
From a security point of view, it makes sense. Better stop the Russians in Ukraine than somewhere else. But from your pure national responsibility standpoint, are you going to say, I consciously weaken the defense of my region in order to put the troops somewhere? And most countries said, let's think about again when we are there. And I have to say, in the moment, I see no indication whatsoever for a ceasefire, because from a Russian perspective, things are going well. So I don't see it happen anytime soon. So things might change until we are there.
Pedro Sanchez could send some Spanish troops, because as he said, tanks can't get over the Pyrenees, right? So he's safe.
You shouldn't be cynical about our life insurance.
I'm not cynical. I want to get questions from the audience, but just on that point about how people are not willing to deploy troops to Ukraine because it weakens them. And then the other big anecdote, which is that in The Hague next week, we're going to be talking about European defense spending, essentially not about Ukraine. Zelensky, we don't even know what role he's going to play. Biber, is there a danger here that this new debate is about Europe and we're forgetting Ukraine, and Ukraine could get lost here, where Europe decides we've got to take care of ourselves? Not Ukraine.
No, I don't think we are forgetting Ukraine at all. I mean, Ukraine currently is the biggest army in Europe and the strongest deterrent to Russia's further invasion. So if we look at the security and defense for the whole of Euro-Atlantic, there are three big lines of efforts that we see. One is strengthening national collective defense, and that is what we have been discussing. It's, percentages, but it's also defense industry actually providing and producing what we need for those 5%. Because, if 155 ammunition was costing 2,000 before the invasion, now it's 8,000. So you can raise your defense spending as much as you want. If you can get the amount that you need for that money, that's a problem. So it's there are indications that actually the efforts by the EU through the ASAP program in setting up the ammunition factories and so on and so forth is making a difference. It is coming about, but we still need to step up as European defense industry, as Euro-Atlantic defense industry. So strengthening our national collective defense capabilities is one line of effort. Second is weakening Russia, because that's the cheapest way to peace in Europe. Going after Russia's oil exports, which is 30% of Russia's budget. Gas. Why would we buy Russian gas?
Cheap.
There are other options. It costs to have energy independence. If we want to support Russian economy and it finances war from the budget, okay, we can buy the gas, but better not. And the third is supporting Ukraine, continue support in all ways. If there are countries who can do military support, they can do medicines, they can do humanitarians, they can do all types of other enabling issues, demining. So those three lines of efforts will bring peace to Europe, but each one requires both political leadership, military capability, and especially on weakening Russia, involvement of businesses. It's nothing else that can help. And just to tell you, we provide about 1% of GDP to Ukraine, everything that we can, both militarily, and there, again, defense production will help also support Ukraine. Because at a certain moment the warehouses were empty. Again, with the production, it is improving. But also on the sanctions implementation, we are an external border of EU and NATO. Before the sanctions were imposed, we were not checking what was exiting EU into Russia, Belarus, to Central Asia or elsewhere, because there was no need for that. It was a Russian task to do that, what's coming in there, and our task was to check incoming goods. But now, since sanctions were imposed, we have strengthened our customs. We are investing a lot of additional resources. That's not covered by defense expenditure or anything else, so it's from the national budget. And what we are seeing is that 80% of goods going into Russia or Belarus are of origin of other EU states, so not Latvian. And from all the violations we find, the percentage is even higher.
Wow.
Close to 90% of violations. Wrong customs codes, wrongly filled the customs declarations, not checked final destination, you know, a yurt somewhere in the steppe of Kazakhstan is not a receiver of goods, right, of dual-use goods and so on and so forth. So if our customs officials have to do it, German companies, French companies, Italian companies can do that. It's the obligation, because the sanctions implementation is a national obligation for the countries. So, and that is something that we see. We have a monthly reports from the customs and the dialogue there, and Russia benefits from that.
Just quickly before we go to the audience, I want to ask you all three the same question. Is the NATO summit next week going to be a success? Do you think Trump gets on the plane and says, NATO's never been stronger, thanks to me, we're all spending more? Claudia, Norbert, Baiba.
To be very honest, I have no clue, because if you learn something with Trump, that it's total unpredictability and volatility. But my impression is that it is really well prepared, and if it would work for him, it would be, from my understanding, his first foreign policy success. So this is something he could bring home. And I mean, if you look at Russia-Ukraine peace, it wasn't really successful. If you look at Israel-Iran, there's an issue. So this could be an easy win. I mean, it has been from 2 days, we are down to a 2-hour session.
Yeah.
One topic, 5%, against one answer, commitment to Article 5. And then a lovely royal dinner in the evening. So it should be feasible. So my hope is it will work. But again, I don't know. I gave up on trying to predict Trump.
Norbert?
So my expectation is that for us, the Europeans, it will be a security policy success.
Right.
By doing all what Baiba mentioned means buying time for us, and now we can fill the time by rearming Europe.
Yeah.
So it will be a success on substance for us. And my guess is that Donald Trump will use it as a communication success. He will sell it as his success. I eventually made these European guys pay. So I did it. I achieved it. Even Obama and all my predecessors were talking about it, and I got it.
Yeah.
We are working towards it. I mean, there are still some wordings that needs to be finalized. It will be very much around the 5% defense spending. It will be very much around the signal to defense industries that, okay, this is the time. And it will be very much about also this sort of organization that has a very strong brand, NATO, and at the same time adapting to the reality that we are in. And that also requires technology. There's a lot of, as I said, you know, the military planning was against Russia's capabilities in 21. What we are seeing today with the drones, what we are seeing today with the electronic warfare, what we are seeing with the scalability and autonomy of Russia's forces in technological sector, it's something that we need to adopt. We are not there yet as NATO, as a collective defense force, and that is, I think, the challenge for all our militaries, how to quickly adapt. So there is a specific adoption plan that NATO is now moving ahead, but so it needs. Okay, we have a lot of small producers that are producing quite good but expensive drones.
Yeah.
So how to get to the cheaper, scalable, autonomous versions that actually works and intercepts Russian drones or identifies and so on and so forth. So there is a lot civil military elements that NATO is dealing with currently, and defense industry forums that will be hosted in parallel to the summit is actually a very important element of the summit itself.
And our next panel will be all about how to do that from someone who does it every day in Ukraine. Questions from the audience for this panel? This gentleman here. Could you introduce yourself? And if you keep your questions really short,
can we have ladies asking questions?
Absolutely. I will take the first lady to put their hand up. Absolutely.
Hear me?
Yeah, absolutely, loud and clear.
Thank you for this nice panel. My name is Ronald Nittenberg from Industrial Minerals. I have a question about, we heard a lot about the new spending initiatives in Europe, but what about the change of command structure within NATO based in Europe?
What about it?
You probably mean the new force structure, because a change of command structure currently is not something that NATO is planning. There is the 2 strategic commands and several operational commands. There's a new operational command in Norfolk, which deals with the North, with the Arctic, in accordance with defense plans. But Brunssum, which takes care of the center, that is not changing. But the new force structure is significant because that, of course, is about how we fill those defense plans. Where do you need the headquarters? Where do you need the local headquarters? And so on and so forth. So the German forces have their own headquarters in Lithuania. And we host the multinational brigade headquarters and the planning capability in Latvia for the region there, because the planning is joint.
But the overall command is still in American hands at the moment, right? For the defense of Europe, isn't that something the Americans want to get away from, and the Europeans should take over?
They just replaced. They just got the new SACEUR has just been announced, and it is again an American Air Force. It's an American general, and it's an Air Force general.
And it's two-hatted. The head, the commander of EUCOM, which is American forces in Europe, is also the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. So it has 2 hats. So it commands SHAPE, which is NATO's headquarters, and EUCOM, which is here in Germany. So
maybe a quick comment on that. If you look at the rhetorical dimension, the US communication has been catastrophical towards European defense. Can put it very bluntly. I remember, I think we were all in Munich, we all listened to the Van speech, where the US vice president said the biggest danger is not from the outside, it comes from within. And then you had several statements that really questioned our idea of an alliance. But on the practical level, so far we haven't had fundamental, substantial changes so far. There were tiny things, but the new SACEUR, everybody was like, oh, we'll be getting a new SACEUR. The new SACEUR is there. The positions in the international structures are stuffed. So we have in the moment an interesting situation where on the political level we all feel like they are gone, but on the practical level we don't have a change yet. And as Baiba already said, or Norbert, under Trump 1 we had more troops in Europe than before. So I think it is very difficult after 4 months to really say where we are going to. Of course you can say deterrence happens in our minds and in the minds of the adversary. Do the Russians still believe the Americans are coming? Do we still believe the Americans are coming? So you have a lot of political, you have a huge political dimension of deterrence. Yeah. And obviously the whole talk is weakening it. But in practice, and I really underline it, it hasn't changed. You could even say here positive statements like Hecthis and Shangri-La, almost praising the Europeans. So we have uncertainty, we have inflammatory statements, but the practice hasn't changed, and I think we should not forget about it. just a reminder between what's happening here and what's happening there so far.
Do you have a question from any female members of the audience? Bye-bye, I'm sorry, I tried. John Atta at the back.
Thank you, Jean-Arthur Regibaud from Belgium. I have a related question about the EU and Ukraine. On the one hand, we have the EU granting EU candidate status to Ukraine. On the other hand, we know that the EU is not able to guarantee Ukrainian security. Is it not a bit of a contradiction?
Norbert.
I would say not at all. Not at all, because the EU perspective for Ukraine is a perspective for Ukraine to develop in a viable, democratic, and economically prosperous way. So this is the future, and this is what it is all about. Ukraine decided to become European, not necessarily an EU member, but decided to become European. This was, in a way, the divorce declaration towards Russia, or Putin perceived it at that, because he insists to have Ukraine as a country as a part of a sphere of influence, and to become a democratic, market-oriented economy and a country implied that Ukraine decided to become a success model, as the Poles and the Baltic countries have become by becoming European. And this now is the confirmation of the European Union. Yes, we stand to your aspiration to become European and a member of the European Union. And this is fundamental. This is, I would say, this is the root cause of the war, this Ukrainian decision. And at the same time, of course, out of solidarity and out of our own security interests, because there is no illusion if Putin were to be successful with his attempt to reintroduce war as a foreign policy tool in the 21st century in Europe, he wouldn't finish in Ukraine, he would go further, and we were to see a fundamentally different Europe. So this is our own interest to support Ukraine, and we are doing that. So there are two dimensions: the political perspective, the economic cooperation, and other elements and spheres of cooperation that has already started and gives trust to the Ukrainian people that it's worthwhile for their future to fight this war. And the other dimension is the military dimension. We are engaging in for, as I mentioned, also our own security interests. So it's no contradiction at all.
And there's an economic element in all that, of course, single market expanding to Ukraine, 40 million plus people, standards, production, gaining wealth, becoming richer. All our companies will be better off again, because that's what we need. But I fully agree with Norbert that the start was Ukrainian decision to sign association agreement with the EU, and that's when Russians really went hard against them and denied that opportunity. Yanukovych, remember there was such a president, a Russian puppet, and he was one who refused to sign, and that's how Maidan uprising started. And
but there was if I might just add, initially we thought of a sequence.
Yes.
And the sequence was the same that was with the Baltic and Poland. NATO accession first, that's the security and defense survival element, and the EU accession second, because you have first need the kind of safe space and then you enter that. Also because NATO accession is a more political one where the EU is really ticking boxes in all the chapters. And this sequence has been changed due to the changing US position that very clearly said, we don't see it happen. So there is indeed the security element you hinted at, that if Ukraine one day, or when Ukraine one day becomes a member, it would benefit from Article 42.7, which is a mutual defense clause. But I think one element in our debate here is the reference point.
Yeah.
We usually say we have to spend more because Americans are leaving. That's a totally wrong reference point. Our reference point should not be a reaction to the US, but we should be able to protect what we have, even if Americans are staying. So I see this sequencing element that is a tough one, but the ambition should be to be able at some point, not to replace Americans, we will not be able to, but to build our own genuine European defense and way of deterrence and war to be able to do that.
Very good. We have time for one more question. Yes, gentleman here.
Roman Kovalchuk, Belarusian Christian Democracy. I have a question to Her Excellency Minister Baiba Braže. Can you elaborate a bit on Baltic evacuation plan? How distant Russia's threat of incursion is, and does Belarus matters in context of that threat? Thanks.
I can say nothing about the Baltic evacuation plan because I don't know anything about such a plan, to tell you frankly. But so I mentioned Zapad exercise that Russia will be conducting. So every year it tries to conduct a strategic exercise in different parts. So this year it will be very much around Belarus. And Russia will try to show how integrated Belarus is in its operations, both in terms of interoperability of forces and the presence and the operations and so on and so forth. So quite clearly that is a change from where Belarus was before. So if we take that into account, obviously it's not just an enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine, but actually through this exercise, if these predictions come true, is actually an integrated part of Russian military planning and exercising and force projection. And in our military planning, within NATO, within nationally, we have taken that into account. So that is not something that is a big surprise in the last few years. So defense Poland, defense Lithuania, defense Latvia is very much also including that element.
And of course, it reinforces the debate that you'll be having next week around the need to spend this money, not just because Trump's saying it, but because there's actually a threat out there.
Absolutely, but also because with Finland and Sweden joining NATO, of course, the whole planning and the whole exercising and everything has changed. You know, it's a different situation for NATO currently, and a much better, much more comfortable one in a very practical way. And on the U.S., so the U.S. interest, the troops' interest, the army and the all forces' interest in Europe is to exercise together. It's really literally, it's not, they don't come here to sit in the bases and, you know, just eat burgers. They come here to literally exercise, to work together with Germans, with Balts, with Dutch, to try different scenarios. So we just have currently a big Baltops exercise, the biggest in the Baltic Sea. And you can see so many different elements there, how America is projecting force, you know, directly from the US, how the sea and the air and the land works together, integrating the drones, integrating all types of special forces operations. And that is what military does. Yep. They are good at it and they enjoy working together. They find that they learn from each other. And this is also with Ambassador Whitaker. We spent a day with the US troops and Latvian troops on Sunday in Latvia. And US Marines literally were learning how our National Guard is integrated into armed forces. And they had not realized that, for example, they will be working with the National Guard. It's part of Special Operation Forces, particular red-blue type of exercise. So it's a lot of practical interoperability that is taking place. And that is why US presence in Europe is not a static presence.
Yeah.
They come and go, they increase forces because of the exercising. Strategic bombers fly to show the nuclear deterrence element. So it's everything together.
It's a good positive note to end on. Don't read the Truth Socials. Watch the joint exercises. The Americans are still here.
Well, read the Truth Social.
Read the Truth Socials, and then move on. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Claudia, Norbert, Baiba, thank you ever so much. Thank you for listening. of the follow-up from that discussion, and as I was saying, this is the war in Ukraine and how the Ukrainian defense industry has responded so well to that and how Europe can learn. So to discuss that, we have Alexander Yakovenko, who's the founder of TAF Drones, who's going to be in discussion with our very own Alec Russell. So let's welcome them to the stage.
Thank you, Henry, and thank you, the previous panel, which sets up the conversation with Alexander tremendously. We're very, very lucky to have this man. A week or so ago, you were in China, frantically trying to shore up the production line of all the spare parts you need for the drones that are so essential to the defense of Ukraine. I think we'll talk a little bit later about a very important new deal that you've just done with the Danish government, which could be transformational. You also have an appointment this afternoon in Barcelona for your daughter's birthday. So we have to get him out in time. So quick questions at the end of this session, and we will just crack on. Alexander, the headlines at the moment are, of course, all about war in Iran, not about war in Ukraine. I just wondered if you could say at the beginning just how the tensions in Iran are affecting the war in Ukraine, you think?
Right now, the situation is very complicated. We got a huge problem with our air defense system, as you can see for the previous news. A lot of massive strike of the civil infrastructure. It's a huge problem also. But the main problem, the war began to be like a slow war of attrition. It means that we do not understand, our population do not understand the final goal. We understood, unfortunately, that it's impossible to win right now in the geopolitical situation, especially with the United States, as we can see. And of course, the whole mood of our military and civil are very bad, possible to say. But no one think about the defeat. According to the last information and the questions that was asked by our civilian, we will defeat our countries as longer as it possible. But the main problem and the main goal is that we have to understand why we have to do it, because when we see that the international policy are changes, we can't understand what it will be, like a final vision of this war.
When I first met you, it was in your headquarters in Odessa, and I know that when you were there, you were back and forth to the front line, as are your colleagues. Some people have described the front line in Ukraine now as being something out of Star Wars. I wonder if you could just set the scene, which is tremendously important for this discussion, and tremendously important for people here just to remember. Just set the scene. What is it like on the front line now? Is the Star Wars analogy hideously correct? You are so involved in the drone revolution. Just quickly explain what is happening on the front line right now.
Nowadays, the modern front line, it's not about the trenches and the artilleries. It's in the air. The gray zone between the both sides, it's approximately 20-25 kilometers. And each month, each year, it stays wide and wider. Why so? Because the technology is developed, and in this zone, it's a kill zones. In 20-25 kilometers between the two sides, it's impossible to have any equipment, soldiers, military units, because it will be destroyed very soon. Is the first one. The second one, the military doctrines. It's now outdated. For example, the heavy armored vehicles. not to play any roles in the battlefields, because it could be destroyed by the FPV drones, which cost approximately $400, and the tanks, which cost $5 million, will be destroyed very quickly. What does it mean for us? For us, it's rather good, because we try to build the wall of the drones. What does it mean? That in each military units we've got our operators, and our enemy is very complicated to go through these walls of drones. But the tactics is changes, for example, and right now they use like a small units, for example, on the motorbikes. First time it was very funny, but it not was funny for a long time, because in few weeks to use these units, they go through to our defense system. That's why our enemy always develops their technology, their tactics. We try to do the same, but as you can see, they got a huge advantages in the soldiers, in the equipments. That's why they bite the part of our territory day by day, month by month. Yes, it's a small one, but anyway, they did it, and there is now any possibility from their side to go through our front line for our defense system. It will be not like was in how we do this operation in Kharkiv, in Kursk, in Kherson, but they did not think, Russia did not think about their soldiers, about their people. They are engaging them, and unfortunately, they use them so massive, especially in Sumy region right now. I was there, I saw it. Each day they sent 200-300 people, soldiers, they died, and they say the next day much more. And it's impossible from our side to protect our city from such huge, massive attacks.
So just to clarify one of the things that Alexander was saying, the trick of these motorcycle attacks is that if you send enough people over on motorcycles, you just don't have enough drones to take out the individual attackers. You were talking about how quickly it is changing, and I wonder if you could shed some light on what's happening in your own business, how quickly you're having to adapt. Because I think I'm right in saying, I mean, for example, do you remember at the start of the war we heard all about the Bayraktar drones, the Turkish drones? You never hear about them now. I mean, it's just like they're outdated. Tell us about the pace of change and how you deal with it in your business.
It's so crazy and so high speed changes. For example, from idea to battle-proof technology, it could pass approximately 1 month. It means that in 1 month we have to make the design, production, logistics, and then to the front line. And in addition, to have the battlefield improvement. Everything changes very quickly, especially in technology, in electronic warfare system and in UAV systems. Half year ago, no one thinks about the optic fiber drones. Right now it's a standard. 1 year ago, it was rare to see the drones at night. Nowadays we use thermal cameras and drones at night everywhere to hit the logistics supply chain of our enemy. 2 years ago, when we started production of different kinds of drones, especially FPV, mostly experts, engineers say that it's very simple technology. In few months, it will be impossible to use it. But right now, it's a main weapon on the battlefield.
There's been an impression, certainly in the West, in the last few years, that Ukraine has been brilliant at innovation, brilliant at technological innovation, and Russia has relied on large numbers and a big production line, but that it has something of an old Soviet sort of mindset and is quite slow-moving and so on.
But is that actually accurate? Because the Russians are also developing very rapidly, aren't they?
Yes, unfortunately so. And for example, if compare our advantages and disadvantages, we are still in step ahead of our enemy in technology, but unfortunately we've got a lot of good decisions, but we can't scale them due to the supply chain, due to the production, because we are always under the missile attacks. At the same time, our enemy take their best decision and scale it very quickly because they do not have any horizontal system. They've got the very strong vertical. They say to produce Shahed, and right now they do it like at least 300 per day. It's a huge amount. And unfortunately, for example, there is some people think that Iran will not provide anyway right now these Shaheds to Russia, but they do not need to provide it. The production are in Russia right now. They made the transfer of technology. That's why they will produce it anyway, and they will develop this technology in future. For example, at the last 6 months, we saw at least 3 or 4 generations of the Shaheds. With more speed, with better electronic warfare resistance system, and they develop their technology very quickly because they've got more resources, first of all, and the second one, unfortunately, sanction does not work very good. It's one step to accept the sanction, but another one to check work it and implement it. And as we can see, there is huge amount of resistors, any flight controllers, cameras, thermal cameras from the Western countries. From China, of course, we understood it, but also from the Western countries also.
Let's talk about the supply chain, because that is absolutely essential, and it's something that a lot of the people in the audience, it's an issue that they will be aware of for their own businesses, I guess. I remember you saying a few months ago in Odessa that 90% of your spare parts came from China, in particular the thermal cameras, but not just the thermal cameras, the carbon frames and so on. And you just have to think about this for a moment. If your main provider is thousands of miles away, the other side of Russia, that's really, really difficult. And the Chinese market is very complex to navigate. But there were 2 big factors here for you, as far as I recall. One of them is cost, because the Chinese parts were much, much cheaper than getting parts from Europe. And the other was that it was just really hard to get the parts from Europe. Well, in the previous panel was just talking about a shift in defense procurement. Do you see any sign of change? How is Europe adapting? Is it adapting? Is it doing enough in terms of drones?
Yeah, okay. First of all, only my company paid to China for the last 2 years more than $1 billion for the spare parts and components for the UAV.
Huge figure.
Huge figure. And we are in the one of the biggest, but not the biggest one. It means that we develop the UAV industry in China. I can compare. 1 month ago, I was on the exhibition in Shenzhen, and at the same exhibition I was 1 year ago. And it's the difference one. What does it mean? That they develop so huge, and the new technology, new companies, Russia and Ukraine invest to China a huge amount of the money, and they use them to develop their technology. Is the first one. The second one about the Europe. Unfortunately, European and Western countries previously didn't want to develop like a simple technology. What does it mean? It looks like a toys, like a flight controllers for the FPV or thermal cameras with no very high resolution. The European countries does not see any sense to develop it and to make the production in Europe. That's why all of this issue over this technology produced in China, first of all. And for example, we can't find the thermal cameras for our drones in Europe. Yes, it's possible to buy, for example, from the FLIR, it's a very famous company from Sweden, but was bought by US. But it will be costing 3 times more. Western MOD have got the policy, no Chinese components. That's why right now, I know a lot of companies in Europe which try to develop localization. But we have to be honest. It looks like localization, but without real localization. What does it mean? Thermal cameras. Yes, it could produce in Czech Republic, but the sensors, the main parts of these cameras, will be imported from China. But it will look like European made by in Europe. What does it mean? That it's very important to develop the components, electronic components, and to make the localization. Of course, it's like this investment could be outreach. I mean that there is no sense will be in this investment in future. But if we would like to have our own components and not to be depends from China, we have to do it.
Alexander's tremendously modest when he was talking about his company. Just to be clear, when Russia launched the full-scale invasion in February 2022, you made 0 drones. You ran a logistics company. His company now, I think in the first 6 months of this year, had contracts in Ukraine, of course, for 350,000 drones, and it all stemmed from a decision on day one when the missiles were coming into Odessa, and you just sent a message out to all your staff saying, you don't have to stay, you can go, but if you want to stay, we're going to rethink the business and do something different. Is that roughly what happened?
Yeah, 24th of February, I woke up on explosion, unfortunately. I was in Odessa. My family was abroad in Spain on vacation. And in this way, I take the decision to stay in Ukraine, to defend my countries. I write to my colleagues in my companies. I own a rather huge logistics company. And our first step was to be the volunteers, to help our armies. We tried to find suppliers and to supply to our army from warm clothes till night vision goggles, to find everything that is possible to find in these cases. In autumn 2022, I had my first battle experience. We was in Zaporizhia, and it was my first experience to use the FPV drones on the battlefield. And I understood that it will be the future. That's why in 2023 we started to build our first factories with our military units. Unfortunately, it was struck by Russia in August 2023. But in the end of the year, we established a new one, and in the beginning of the 2024, we received our first state contracts. It was very transparency, without any bureaucracy, because our government needs the drones. In 2024, we produce more than 350,000 drones. This year it will be more than 500,000, but most important that we are the biggest importer of the components to Ukraine, and we help to develop the ecosystem in Ukraine. We provide the components to the other producer of drones to help to find them a solution. because the supply chain is very complicated right now. We've got very good experience in it. Try to make the diversification, try to make the localization of the components, because each month it's more complicated to make the logistics from China. It's more complicated to make the logistics from US also. That's why we try to make the localization. Our government tried to support it. I saw a lot of European Union companies which try to establish the companies and to develop the technology, UAV technology, not only like drones, but most important components in Europe. That's why our next step to make the localization.
On which front? I wonder if you could say a little bit about this Danish deal that you've just done, which you were just starting to talk to me about next door, which sounds transformational.
It's a very good program of Scandinavian countries, Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Baltic countries. There is a program according to we go very quickly from the first touch till signed agreement. It was only 2 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm aware that time is ticking away. I've got one more question. We'll open it up to the floor. You talked about how you realized early on that FPV, first-person view drones, were the future. I wonder if you could again look into the future at how you see technology developing on the battlefield.
Of course. The next step, it's a full autonomy of the drones, artificial intelligence, first of all. Of course, according to the international law, it's possible to do because it's forbidden to hit the target without approval from the pilot. But as we can see, unfortunately, international law does not work. That's why, in any cases, it will be the next step. It will be AI technology, first of all. That's the second one. The military doctrine are outdated, and it should be developed very quickly. As I said previously, heavy armored vehicles does not work on the battlefield. The first one. The second one is very important, that the military company and any companies in Miltech in Europe, they try to develop their technology in a long way. That means it spent 3, 5, 10 years, and the big company understand the risks. They do not want to change their strategy, and they can't to change their strategy very quickly. But the modern war show us that the technology which was developed 5 years ago could be not used in the modern war. That's why, of course, it's very important to develop such technology like aircraft, F-35, Patriot, or something like this. But without the simple technology like the FPV drones, you can't to win on the battlefield. It's impossible.
Questions from the floor? Any questions? I can go on asking questions, but I see a hand back there. Yep.
Hi, Stefan from Ox Robotics. First of all, thank you so much for the insights. You spoke about the speed of change and how critical it is to maintain an advantage. Speed of change also means your procurement in Ukraine needs to be really flexible, really fast. In Europe, we still have the perception that our procurement is very safety first, and you have a mission first procurement. What as Europeans we can learn from the Ukrainian procurement systems?
First of all, to do less bureaucracy and to do more localization. What does it mean about the bureaucracy? Right now, the first 2 steps of our government was to open the market for the private companies. It means that to make the codification, the product, the military product, according to the NATO standard, we have to spend 3 months. Previously, it was approximately 3 years. In Europe, it's still 3 years. In 3 years, this technology will be outdated. Yeah, it will be, there is no sense to do it. That's why to change the law standard and the bureaucracy, at least it should be 6 months. That's all, no more. The first one. Second one, from the one hand to make the localization, from the other one to be more open to the international market. I understood the non-Chinese policy, but as I said previously, even in EU-made technology, there is like Chinese components. That's why I do not understand the sense of this.
Any more hands up there? Okay, I'm gonna ask you another question. When we last spoke, was actually in London after our encounter in Odessa. We were talking about the state of the war, and you said that Ukraine could keep going without American support, but it was going to be tough, and that inch by inch Russia would continue to advance. That was 2 or 3 months ago. Has your view changed? How do you see the war unfolding now, if America is pulling back as it seems to be?
It's not popular to say it like this, but I will try to be honest with you. It's a slow war of attrition. It means that we will defend our country, I think, during 2, maybe 3 years. The enemy will bite our territory step by step, and we will wait for a miracle, because I do not understand the other way. Maybe something will change in the international policy, and it will be more strict support us. But anyway, from our side, we will do the best. We made our choice to be the part of the Europe, as was said on the previous panel. It's our choice, democracy choice. Right now, we have to understand which part of Ukraine will be part of the Europe. Unfortunately, the reality looks like this.
Well, I'm obviously sorry you couldn't present a more optimistic picture, but we wouldn't have expected you to try and sugarcoat the situation. Well, I would just like to thank Alexander. He's 2 remarkable things in one. He's playing an extraordinarily important role in the defense of Ukraine, and he also is, as I think will be written about when this war is over, and it will end. He's a case study in business adaptability and brilliant resilience, and many congratulations, and thank you for coming to talk to us, and get going now to your daughter's birthday.
Thank you so much.
I feel we almost need to have a slight pause after that, but we're not going to, I'm afraid. We're going straight on to a session that is obviously of huge practical interest to the chief executives and chief operating officers and others here in the audience. We're really going to turn squarely to the global economy and the trade war. Again, like the situation in Ukraine, it's slightly fallen from the headlines briefly because of the dramas in Iran. But as Katie Martin, my brilliant colleague, the FT's markets columnist, and other panelists are about to explain, this is far from disappeared. So we're going to be addressing how to navigate economic uncertainty in the age of Trump, tariffs, and turmoil. I'd like to welcome to the platform a terrific panel. It's going to be moderated by my colleague Laura Patel, who's our Berlin correspondent. We brought together Germany's finance minister from the last parliament. Thank you for coming. Top German economist, top executive from a consulting firm, and as I mentioned earlier, Katie Martin, who you can read and you can also listen to on her terrific podcast. So, Laura, easy subject, Laura, how to survive a trade war.
No problem for these guys, I don't think. Yes, I'm very excited to be joined by this wonderful panel. Katie's our market supremo and columnist and podcaster in London. Jörg, until very, very recently, was finance minister, and before that, kind of G7 and G20 Sherpa for the German government. And we've got Veit, who's the head of Germany at Alex Partners, consultancy that is helping business to navigate the kind of choppy waters out there right now, and Martin Morrison, chief economist at DWS, which is the asset management arm of Deutsche Bank. So Jörg, I wanted to start with you. We all know what happened on April the 2nd on Liberation Day when Trump unveiled these tariffs, but not many of us were actually in the room, in one of the biggest, in government, in one of the biggest economies in the world. It was quite complex times here in Germany. We'd just come out of elections, coalition negotiations were in a very crunchy stage, and then you had this very difficult global backdrop unfolding, and you were in charge and you were involved, I think, in briefing Friedrich Merz on the situation, right? Can you tell us a bit about what that was like and what you told him?
Yeah, I mean, it was pure coincidence that I was in Washington a few days before the 2nd of April and spoke with Jameson Greer and Scott Bessent and many of the people advising Trump. And the week before, the car tariffs had just been announced. So we had basically this double whammy of first the car tariffs, which of course, given the importance of the automotive sector for our economy and exports, but also imports from the US. And then came the much broader announcement on the 2nd of April. So that was definitely a shock. Whether it ends up being a healthy shock or an adverse shock, TBD, because of course, as we all saw, the Trump administration later opened up for negotiations, and that is still ongoing. And as Friedrich Merz said in Canada at the G7, there is hope that we will get an agreement before the summer break. So I think that's the sort of uncertainty that the market has at the moment, and you can see it in all measures, in all asset classes, that this uncertainty is being priced in higher volatility, in very sharp price movements. We still remember the sharp price movement after the 2nd of April immediately. I think that also gave an insight that this is definitely a lose-lose proposal if it were executed in its full scope, and I think that market reaction was also quite instructive and quite important, in addition to the unified protest from around the world to the US government reconsidering its position. But nothing is decided, so still a lot of negotiation to be done.
You said it's unclear to you whether it's kind of a positive shock or a negative shock, TBD, but I think it's fair to say that the backdrop helped spur the decision that Merz made to do away with the Schuldenbremse, the debt break for defense spending, and create this big infrastructure fund, right? I mean, so maybe for Germany in some ways it's...
Well, for that I would say the Oval Office Trump-Zelensky meeting was more momentous, because at the time, in April, everything was done already. So I wouldn't draw a direct causal line between the trade announcement and the debt break issue. I mean, the whole debate around tariffs and restrictions to free trade certainly played a role in that decision. But I would say the direct linkage was much more the Ukraine and Article 5 questions and many of the issues around the uncertainty around foreign and defense policy. But what I'm referring to in terms of a positive shock is what it did trigger, and there I fully agree with you, is that in the final stretch of the negotiation around the coalition agreement, it did sharpen the senses that competitiveness is of the essence for Germany. And despite the fact that there were already quite a few ideas around economic reforms and doing more in addition to the fiscal reforms. Certainly the pressure from the tariffs increased the willingness to do more in terms of economic reforms. Now we can have a huge debate around whether it's enough, and I'm sure there's economists who will say that we need more, and absolutely agree, but it's already, I mean, it definitely drove the direction of travel that Germany is doing more, and is also pushing in Brussels that we don't only have a sort of portfolio of national reforms in Europe, but that the European level also in and of itself has to get its act together and accelerate the implementation of the Draghi report, which is still in large parts outstanding.
So Veit, we've heard the view kind of from the top of government. You've been much more kind of on the ground, helping your clients, companies like manufacturers with like production all over the world to try and navigate this kind of wild west that we're in right now. Can you talk us a bit about you told me you've been running war rooms, trying to help them like scenario plan. What's that been like, and what have you been advising companies that you work with?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's important to know that it's a stressful time for executives, for CEOs. It's not an easy time. Because CEOs ask themselves, we don't understand where this is going to. What we need to understand is we know that it puts pressure on margins, it puts pressure on prices. And you need to ask yourself the question, so what can you do to mitigate the detrimental effects on your business? So focus on what you can control. I mean, you can't control tariffs as an executive, but what you can control is certainly your own financial flexibility, your access to cash. You can work on your cash positions. You can review your lines of credit, because running out of credit and running out of cash means running out of options. And on top of this, certainly, you need to find a suitable response for your business to increasing tariffs, because no matter actually where we are going to end now with this customs war, the final destination will be we will have higher tariffs. I think there is almost an agreement, certainly, if you look at a broader scale, we will see somehow increasing tariffs. Now, the question is also, now how do you respond to increasing tariffs? And you mentioned war rooms. Yes, I mean, we established dozens of tariff war rooms or tariff command centers to help companies going line by line to their different end products and their different components to find alternative supply chain options, to reconfigure basically your supply chains to find the most cost efficient, from a tariff perspective, the most cost efficient sourcing capabilities.
But how do you advise a company when things are changing so rapidly? Trump is so unpredictable. He might move production from China to Vietnam, and then maybe he'll whack up tariffs on Vietnam. You know, how can you navigate that?
100%, because we are operating in a time of increased uncertainty. Now, I mean, what can you do? I think acknowledging that the historic just-in-demand and just-in-time supply chains are history. What we have known, I mean, from the time before the pandemic, it's history. And the pandemic itself also didn't break the system. It just revealed, basically, that the system was already broken. Now, what we need today is just-in-case supply chains, so having different options. And what we have seen, I mean, for now almost a decade already, is that companies move production and sourcing out of China to places like Vietnam, Thailand, Mexico, and plenty of other jurisdictions. Now, a tariff war room or tariff engineering or tariff shopping, however you're going to call it, is doing exactly the same, just in an accelerated speed. You are creating different options to remain flexible, because you want to have options as a matter of good risk management, but also to survive in a time of increased uncertainty.
Katie, will you talk to us a bit about what this means on a very big picture scale? Because, I mean, this is the micro of like how executives are moving bits of supply chains and stuff. But, I mean, you've been, you know, I have to say, some of your columns have made pretty scary reading in terms of the implications.
Sorry about that.
Let's look up the implications to global economy. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, well, you know, as Jörg was just saying, you know, the announcement of the global tariffs on April the 2nd was a huge moment for global markets, right? It sparked a lot of volatility, it sparked a lot of uncertainty. The bond markets got pretty messy for a while there, and I think we came quite close to an accident. But actually, the big rethink that's going on in asset management circles started before April the 2nd. You know, right at the start of this year, analysts and investors were starting to say to me, we think we need to think differently about how we invest and whether the US is still a safe investment destination. And that was about all sorts of things. That was about Vance in Munich. That was a big moment for a lot of European asset managers that really put them off US markets. And it's about the dialogue or the rhetoric that we saw at the start of the year about this potential that the US might seek to bolt terms and conditions onto US government bonds with some sort of Mar-a-Lago accord that integrates finance with defense. Now, I don't think that is going to happen, but I do think that once advisors close to the president have articulated that sort of worldview, it's very difficult to unsay it. And so now there is a level of doubt and uncertainty about the safety of US assets that was not there before. Now, when I speak to investors in the US, they say, look, this shock that we had in markets on April the 2nd was very unpleasant, but buy the dip has always worked. We're going to buy the dip now. It has actually worked out pretty well, slightly annoyingly. but the mood from the US is this is a blip and we will get back to normal. Now, when I speak to asset managers in the UK, in Europe, and in Asia, that's not what they say at all. They say something fundamental has shifted and broken here. We don't trust the dollar in the way that we used to. We don't trust US government bonds in the way that we used to. And we have realized that kind of by accident, we are hugely overweight US in our stocks portfolios. And, you know, so the US is something like 70% of developed market global indices and 60% of global indices. That's just too high when you bake in the level of volatility that we've seen so far this year and when you bake in the political risk that has reared up over the course of 2025. So US investors are sticking with the US. They have no currency risk to worry about. But global investors, and you know, Martin will know better than me on this, are saying we don't like the risk that comes from the sliding dollar. We don't like the political risk that comes with US markets. We don't like the talk of capital controls, effectively, that are embedded in this Section 899 in the One Big Beautiful Bill. And so global portfolios are thinking about how they recalibrate and how they beef up in Europe. And that's why European stock markets have been performing so much better than US stock markets so far this year. I feel like this is a really big moment and that a lot of people in the US have not got that message yet.
Do you want to jump in, Martin?
Yeah, this is something that we are currently are observing. Yeah? First of all, you can see that, for instance, Asian investors have far more interest in Europe than they had before. Normally it was you need to be in America, only America. It's the most capitalistic country you have and therefore invest there. Yeah. That has changed. Same here in Europe. Certainly we see a lot of people thinking, some people are talking about divesting US. I would say that's totally overdone. As a global asset manager, I can safely say diversification is always a good idea, even in these times. So, or not even, especially in these times. Yeah. Equity is always sort of an option of innovation, and nobody knows where the next innovation comes from. So it would be totally unadvisable to divest from the US. But from a European perspective, certainly we have the feeling that we were overinvested US by accident due to this very large tech development that we saw the past years or decade almost. And if we talk to American investors, it's interesting. They are interested for the first time in Europe. Yeah. And with that, we feel quite good, feel quite confident, and that we have a globally diversified portfolio. And certainly, we see more and more interest in Europe. And as a European asset manager, we are quite happy with that.
I think more generally, there seems to be a bit of a divide between our colleague Robert Armstrong coined this term TACO, right? Trump always chickens out. So this view that, yeah, whatever, you know, Trump makes a lot of noise and shouts, but then he backs down and things don't end up being that bad in the end, versus the kind of, like, this is the end of the global trading system as we know it, and the ramifications are only just beginning. And like, I mean, Katie, is it fair to say you're a little bit more on that side of the spectrum?
I'm on the side of the spectrum that says even if he does chicken out, he and people around him have been articulating ideas that are sufficiently worrisome to global asset managers that it doesn't matter if he chickens out or not. He's still said it, and you can't unsay it. And that's why, you know, it's not just about equity portfolios. And Martin is right on this point. I think people are misreading this situation in terms of just because US markets are not falling really heavily doesn't mean that nothing is happening. So it's not about selling US assets. It's not about divestment, as Martin says. It's about the marginal euro, the marginal pound. Every euro and pound that comes into portfolios, there's a new conversation now about, do we put 70% of that into the US, or do we put maybe 55% of that into the US? Do we take the US proportion down? And that's going to be a very slow bleed situation, and it really doesn't matter if Trump chickens out or not at that point. The other thing is, even through this process of chickening out, right? So you have an announcement, a counter-announcement, a cancellation, a delay, you know, whatever. This, as I was suggesting, does raise questions around the suitability of the dollar and of dollar assets as safe havens in times of stress. So what we've seen ever since, particularly since April the 2nd, is that you can't rely on the dollar and on US government bonds to gain in price whenever there is an outbreak of nerves in markets. That correlation has really broken down. And that, I think, is a reflection of a very real debate about whether the dollar deserves its place as the dominant world's reserve currency. And I think you can already see, Europe obviously sees the opportunity that is open to it there in grabbing that role. We've got this huge fiscal expansion in Germany, which means we've got so many more bunds going around. There's a lot more debt that's available for global investors to buy, for official reserve managers to buy. And I think, you know, not even slowly but surely, but actually quite decisively, you look at recent statements from Christine Lagarde and others, Europe is moving to the point where it is trying to work out how it steps into that role as a bigger reserve currency. We're not talking about whether it should do that, we're talking about how to do it. And I think that's really important.
Jörg, do you agree with that?
Yeah, so first of all, I think that I gain some positivity from the fact that whenever markets react, there is a very rational response by the US government to those things. And of course, I agree with you that just the fact that they say something that they then react to is not a good thing, but I think it's much better that they then do react. And that's, for example, that I don't buy the stories around the Mar-a-Lago Accord, right? I mean, when you talk to all of the advisors of the American president, they do everything that they can to taper down all of the fears around the Mar-a-Lago Accord, including the author of the famous paper, who very clearly is publicly saying, and told me bilaterally and everything, that he wrote this in his time in the private sector. It has nothing to do with actual government policy. It's a portfolio of ideas. It's not a strategy. I mean, so in that sense, I think we have to also be cautious not to overblow things, because you do have a very, economically savvy group of people, Scott Bessent and many others, who know how markets function, who understand it, who don't want to do any harm to the US role as a dominant currency. Maybe they don't want it to be the only dominant currency. But that, in effect, is up to us now, right? Not the Brits among us, but the EU members. I mean, the opportunity is there, but despite all of the proclamations to finally get the capital markets union done, we have yet to see concrete proposals. And the European Council is still in this, I always call it chapeau mode, where it's very easy to get 27 heads of state and government or finance ministers to agree on a chapeau text saying, yes, the capital markets union matters and we are going to do it and we're going to get it done. but it's excruciatingly painful to then implement, reform of insolvency law, cross-border capital taxation, all of the things that makes the American capital market so uniform and so powerful is snail's pace in Europe. And if that doesn't change, like this, we can issue as many bonds as we will, they will still be national debt, and we will still have a very incomplete correlation between the Bund assets and many other European bonds. And as long as that's not fixed, I don't see how it works to really honestly speak of Europe as a true capital markets union. So I still think it's an opportunity. I fully agree with you, but I think the verdict is still out on whether Europe has the power to really move ahead. And given all of the election cycles that we have in Europe coming up, essentially we now have from today almost less than 2 years now.
Veit, what does this mean for companies, multinational companies trying to actually operate day to day? I mean, so on the one hand, you have Donald Trump trying to encourage them to invest in the US, build new factories, but on the other hand, you have these profound shifts going on and big question marks about the outlook for the US economy. If a company is looking to make a choice right now between building a new production facility in the US or one in China, which is the safer bet?
As long as we are having substantial uncertainty, you see basically that investments are going to be delayed until there is more certainty, because investments are multi-year decisions for multi-year prospects. So, and that's exactly what we are currently seeing. You see that discretionary funding, discretionary spend is delayed, so to the extent possible, which is a reasonable thing to do. You are delaying discretionary spend. You are trying to move, again, a positive thing, fixed cost and convert it into variable cost where possible. So what companies can do and what good CEOs are doing now in these times operating under increased uncertainty is create flexibility, so that you have the agility and the possibility to remain agile and respond to different scenarios. Be flexible, basically, have different sourcing options. What you can't do realistically is simply just move your production from one country to another. This doesn't even work within a year, so that's a multi-year prospect, and you only do it under circumstances of certainty, which you currently simply don't have. What you can do is basically controlling what is controllable, working on your balance sheet to remain flexible, working on your cash and your access to credit lines, and as said, having different sourcing options and having efficient supply chain, also from a tariff cost perspective, sufficient, efficient supply chain options. That's most important. And I think there's also room for optimism. Here we are talking a lot about pessimistic prospects, but also, there is AI, there is Gen AI. All these capabilities also help you, for example, to find solutions for finding efficient supply chain options and a variability of risk management options. So, to give you an example, in the past, when reviewing different procurement contracts to find alternative sourcing options to reconfigure your supply chain, it was an exercise of weeks, if not even months, to go through, let's say, 1,000 of contracts. Now, with the help of AI and Gen AI, you can often review and analyze contracts within one day, 1,000 contracts, and then certainly the real work starts, where you bring procurement, logistics, manufacturing, all the commercial responsibles together to reassess your supply chains and to make decisions for sourcing options on the fly. And this is also, something which makes me optimistic, the use of technology, the use of artificial intelligence.
Let's bring it back to the trade negotiations. So the July the 9th deadline is 3 weeks away. And although, as you said, Jörg, we had these quite positive noises from Friedrich Merz this week, there's not actually, any real concrete signs of a deal yet. And the Europeans had started off wanting 0 for 0 on tariffs. But do you think they're going to basically have to be happy settling for a 10% base tariff like the UK has got?
Well, first of all, the European Union proposed a 0 for 0 tariff on industrial manufactured goods. And I don't think it's very surprising that the Americans called that bluff because it didn't include ags, it didn't include services. So I think
it was a negotiating.
It was a good move in terms of making, like saying we don't want to escalate, we want to de-escalate. But I think everyone knew that that was a starting point of a negotiation and not a final point. And I do think it is completely valid and a huge strategic transatlantic opportunity not to fixate ourselves only on the tariffs themselves, but also talk about non-tariff. I mean, what kind of a huge impetus to transatlantic industrial cooperation would it be if we just simply said every car that has the license to operate in a very civilized market like the European Union also has the license to operate in a very civilized market like the United States and vice versa. I mean, how many economies of scales could American and European companies leverage if we just, like a trivially simple, in theory, step, but in practice, then you hear of all of these people saying, oh, but the consumer preferences are different. Yes, of course they're different, but consumer preferences are also different in Sweden and Italy, and that doesn't hinder us from having an internal market. So that would be a huge transatlantic unifier, I think, but there's still a massive amount of resistance. But I do think we also have to talk about the painful topics. I mean, I told Jameson Greer I love steak from his home state of Kansas, and I still don't understand why there's so much reluctance on Mercosur, on the United States, to allow, like all of the 0.9% of our economies in the agricultural sector to prevent a more open exchange of agricultural products. And that is a huge issue in the United States, for example. So I think these non-tariff issues should be sort of almost equal weighted. And then within the tariff issues, I do think the approach that has also been that came from the automotive industry of Europe and that has now been embraced by several governments of thinking about not a gross tariff regime where every individual car that is exported and importing gets slapped with tariffs, but if a company produces 100 units of cars in the United States, a European company produces 100 cars in the United States, it's allowed to import 100 cars not made in the United States tariff-free. So you have only the net imports of cars that are being subjected to tariffs and not the gross amount on both sides. That would be a huge efficiency gain as well if we're not going to go to zero, right? And I think it's also an illusion to go to zero. If you talk to any member of Congress in the United States, they will immediately tell you that lowering tariffs is completely out of the question in terms of realism of getting a majority in the United States House and Senate. So I think those are all my random thoughts of
times we're in. Where are you on the question of whether or not Europe should retaliate with this retaliatory package if there is no deal? Does Europe need to show some muscle, or is it?
Of course, I mean, I mean that goes without saying. Of course, I know as a trained economist that you should hold your cheek and just not respond is, in economic theory, the sort of Pareto optimal response. But I think politically that's quite a naive response as well. So, of course, you have to put the response weaponry on the table and credibly threaten with countering, and I think the European Union is playing that very smart, and Maros Sefcovic is a very good and strong commissioner in that sense by saying we want to go down and we want to reduce, but if there is no agreement and unilateral action, then of course we will respond.
We haven't talked yet about China, and even before Trump 2.0 began, Germany was in the middle of a massive China shock, the threat to the automotive industry and also other sectors too. And there's a debate now about whether or not China's going to flood Europe with more Chinese products in response to these changing tariffs in the world. And I wondered, Martin, what you think about how Europe should respond to that.
Yeah, first of all, I mean, for instance, on EVs, on electric vehicles, we have implemented quite substantial tariffs. And I would say the first 10% are universal. They are not only for Chinese cars, but for all cars. Why do we need that? I mean, I would say get rid of that, so that would lower the cost. As a consumer, I would say it's the cheaper, the better. When it comes to China and flooding European markets, normally also the Pareto optimum the Pareto optimal response to subsidies would be, yeah, so be it. So then we get the stuff cheaper, which is from a consumer perspective nice. But that would also be naive, because we all know that in China these subsidies, they all have a geopolitical background, and with that it would be very naive not to react to it. So therefore I think the reaction of the European Union to have counter tariffs that sort of counterbalance the subsidies given by the Chinese in order to keep European competitive, I would say it's a reasonable thing to do, and this is something that you had to expect. I think the same applies if you come, for instance, to critical minerals. Yeah, it's also you always from an individual company point of view, you could say, well, that's their personal risk, and if they make themselves dependent on one single supplier, so be it. And if that goes wrong, then it's the problem of the company. But as Germany, it sort of becomes also a problem of the country, and for that I feel some sympathy or pity for politicians, because it's a very, very tricky minefield to operate in. But you need to do something to get rid of supply chain dependencies from one single country. I mean, the US tries it with tariffs. Doesn't seem to work that well. We Europeans and Germans tried it with subsidies, subsidizing battery companies or chip companies. Didn't work out that well. So it's a tricky thing, and we will carefully have to observe what is going to evolve next. How to solve it.
You told me before when we were preparing for this panel, though, that you guys have recently upgraded your forecast for Europe. You're pretty optimistic. I mean, how can that be when we're talking about this kind of insane environment?
This is one good thing about the tariffs, that the US is the one who is hurt most. Yeah. So with that, we downgraded our forecast for the US. Previously, last year it was some 3%. Now it's slightly above 1%. So that's a forecast change to the US. In China, we had to lower our forecast as well, but you all know there will be a lot of countermeasures, and therefore we sort of 1 percentage point down and 50 basis points up again. And for Europe, we just upgraded our forecast due to Friedrich Merz, so to say, to the turnaround the new fiscal impulse that we are getting. It's heavily needed, and it's a right moment in time, because everybody sees the necessity to do more on defense, to do more on infrastructure. So there's a necessity. There is the capacity, because thanks God, we are sort of in an industrial recession still. So there are a lot of unused, underutilized capacities in the industrial sector. So you can put money there and to bring up production. It would be more problematic if we were sort of in a boom. Then it's difficult to increase production, but currently that's possible. And we have the fiscal space, I would say. And according to our calculation, even if everybody makes full use, so 3.5% on defense, plus 0.7 public deficit, plus the special fund on infrastructure, even that in 10 years' time, you would end up at some 80% debt to GDP. And that is under rather pessimistic assumptions. So I would say it's the right move in the right point in time.
Katie, do you share the optimism about Europe, or do you think there's just a risk that everyone gets caught in the crosshairs?
I mean, I think there's there's an obvious risk that the US tariffs are damaging to European growth prospects. I think everybody knows that. But you do have certain counterbalancing factors, one of them being you have a pretty accommodative central bank, and the other being that, as you do see this drip of money coming out of the US and into Europe, the entrances into Europe are very narrow. European markets are so small in comparison to the US that even if we see a tiny 1% shift out of the US and into Europe, that's an enormously supportive factor for European markets. That's why we've got some stellar performance in certain European markets at the moment. Investors are also looking at particular European sectors. They're looking at infrastructure. They're looking at defense. There's been a big rethink among asset managers about whether it makes sense under a kind of sustainable investment framework to put money to work in the defense sector. And there has been a rekindling of interest in that sector, which I think does make a lot of sense. So yes, I do share the optimism. I think, you know, when you are going through a period where one of the major economies is having a little, you know, a bit of a moment, you do see a challenge to some pretty fundamental stuff like the rule of law and the quality of policy making. You see these repeated threats heading in the direction of the Federal Reserve, which they're swatting off very well, very
You and
calmly.
I used to spend quite a lot of time covering Turkey together when I was over there, and I never thought that would be good preparation for following what was happening in the US, but then
extremely good preparation, as it turns out. So yes, I think there is a genuine, you know, warmth towards Europe among global investors that simply hasn't been there before. I've never seen people so willing to put money to work in Europe, and even the UK, even the FTSE 100 is doing better than the S&P 500. So, you know, go figure. You don't see that very often. And one of the really big factors here, you know, quite aside from corporate performance, is around the dollar. If you look at the dollar's fallen about 7% on a trade-weighted basis so far this year. That's not that dramatic. And actually that probably tells you that it has much further to go. And when you split out different time zones, you can see that the bulk of dollar selling is coming somewhat from Asia, predominantly from Europe, and not at all from the US. So the US is very much buying the dip in its own assets. You can see that there is this pressure on the dollar that's coming from the other side of the world. And I expect that to be quite long-lasting. And again, that makes it difficult to justify having a 70% weighting in US equities when you know that you're going to get chewed out by the currency move unless you engage in some increasingly expensive hedging, which in any case will, in aggregate, push the dollar lower still. So it's a very bad cocktail for the US. And although Europe does face lots of issues, not least around the potential economic impact of the tariffs, of whatever form they end up being imposed in, there's a very positive investment case that's very unusual.
Right, I'm going to turn over to our wonderful audience. We've got time for just a couple of quick questions, so put your hands up if you'd like to ask something to our panelists. Yeah, this guy over here.
Dennis Barron from the DHL Group. Assuming that we have a solution for the tariff issue right now, either in reaching agreements or a taco scenario, how likely do you think an escalation of that matter is going to be in exactly 12 months from now when the Trump administration is heading into the midterm elections? And how should markets and investors prepare for that?
Do you want to take that? Do you want to take that, Jörg?
Well, I think it's enormously hard to predict because, as we've seen, I mean, I think the FT, I think it was Martin Wolf who had this headline that tariffs are good politics but bad policy. And he explained that by saying they're good politics because they tend to be popular in the polls, but bad policy because they have detrimental effects. But I think that question has now become a lot more complex because the owners of 401k plans have seen that after tariff announcements, their 401k plan NPV tends to drop, and therefore I'm not sure if this correlation holds for this extreme case, and I think that has a lot of repercussions for the midterm scenario that you asked about, because I don't think it's a priori a given that the Trump administration will see it as a sensible electoral campaign strategy to fight this tariff fight going into the midterm elections, right? But that's, you know, like, I am not the right person to judge that, but I do think the fact that the polling numbers went down and many of the indicators that people who manage electoral campaigns tend to look at didn't really benefit from the announcement of a trade conflict policy by the US I think will sort of also drive their thinking.
He'll chicken out again.
A
This
year
kind of
from
way
now.
is the way
I don't know,
yeah,
but
maybe.
I
We can only hope.
I can't make a prediction.
Anyone else? Any more questions? Yeah. Lady over here.
Thank you so much for all of the comments and the constructive optimism that you all brought to this conversation.
Will you introduce yourself?
I'm Hala Zain from ServiceNow. And my question is the following. We know that a lot of the tariffs is about, there's a tariffs deficit between Europe and the US, and that is to the detriment of the US. However, when it comes to services, there's a surplus from the US to Europe. Is there one of the options, because we've discussed various options of discussion to bring in tariffs around services from Europe?
Who'd like to say that? Martin?
Well, still, net, we have a trade surplus with the US, and the US has a deficit, so the goods outweigh the services. Other than that, I'm not a friend of tariffs at all, so I wouldn't do it. What I think is some taxes make sense, because they make also companies, digital companies, make use of the rule of law and all these kind of setting that we have here. So that is something I would be more sympathetic with. So have taxes, yes. Tariffs, I would say no. But one thing, and also this is to the other question, the most, tariffs are sort of also like taxes, and all companies know how to deal with taxes. So once the tax law is clear, the tariff law is clear, companies can operate. Yeah. So that's not a big problem, I would say. The problem is the uncertainty. And I would fear that this sort of adds again to the uncertainty what's going to happen next. So from that perspective, I would rather advise to keep things cool, to de-escalate, to get more clarity. Because companies are delaying their investment decisions, and this is actually the reason why we took down our forecast for the US, and why we did not upgrade our forecast for Europe and Germany in particular further, because this uncertainty is going to stay. And I would advise politicians to do everything they can to bring down uncertainty, because that is the best for investments for companies globally, and in particular for Europe.
We'll take one more. Go on.
I think just one additional point, in addition to that tariffs are bad in general for economics, I think the demand elasticity issue also speaks against tariffs on services, because the Commission very wisely chooses countermeasures based on selecting areas where we have high demand elasticity. We can procure whatever we tariff elsewhere as cheaply and as high quality. If you look at the services that European companies buy from the United States and consumers, like whether it's digital services, whether it's investment banking services, whether it is legal services, whether it's accounting services, just check those on where you want to substitute to, right? There's just
basically be careful on whom you inflict the pain.
Yeah,
right?
And that's the problem, is the incidence then comes to Europe. So I've always, and it's not unambiguously popular in Germany to speak out critically and economically, say tariffs on digital service just don't make a huge amount of sense, because companies just don't have an alternative for cloud services, AI, et cetera, so they just end up bearing the brunt themselves.
Yeah.
The opposite is true for taxes, by the way. So that makes it interesting to have taxes on these digital services, because you don't want to have tax evasion.
One really quick kind of related point on that is something that a lot of European bankers have mentioned to me recently, is that quite a lot of their European clients are more nervous than they were previously about dealing with US banks. And they're looking to use counterparties for stuff like FX transactions or for bond mandates. They're leaning more heavily on European banks than they necessarily were previously on US banks, because they want to spread that risk, and because another sort of related issue is that they want their data to live in Europe rather than living in in the US cloud somewhere. So bubbling beneath the surface, I think there is more of a kind of a force of gravity towards European service providers, particularly in banking and financial services, without any tariffs.
Yeah, what a world. Jörg, in one sentence, what was the advice you gave your successor, Lars Klingbeil, in this world?
Well, I think this whole competitiveness agenda is a huge topic for Germany, and if we want to finance the trillion of debt that we will issue to correctly finance more defense spending and more infrastructure spending, we have to prove to capital markets that Germany is willing to engage in the economic reform program that will spur our potential growth, because only if we do that we get to the modest increases of debt to GDP, which then investors look at for long-term investing. So I think this potential growth reforms is extremely important.
Good. We've used up our time. Thank you so much to our panelists. I'm going to hand back over to Alec now for our keynote. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you those terrific panelists for, yes, a little few scintillas of cautious hope about the tariff world that we're in. For our final session, we are going to turn to the disruptor-in-chief. And we're going to turn effectively to Donald Trump to discuss his approach to the world, to discuss America's role in the world, and indeed the state of the world. I'd like to invite Ambassador John Bolton onto the stage. Ambassador, come up. Ambassador Bolton, as you will know, has served in every Republican administration since and including Ronald Reagan in a number of different and important decisions, roles. Most recently, he served in the first Trump term as National Security Advisor. Ambassador, Donald Trump was elected on a platform of avoiding wars. Just a few days ago, he was talking about talks with Iran. And then after the G7, we see a shift, calling for Tehran's unconditional surrender. He says his patience is wearing thin and has boasted that Ayatollah Khamenei is an easy target. So you've been in the room with him for discussions on Iran. How do you interpret this seeming contradictory position that he's been taking?
For Donald Trump, talk is cheap. And what he says in the morning may or may not be what he says in the afternoon. And what he says on the campaign trail doesn't necessarily reflect the choices he's faced with. He's just looser with words than most politicians because he's had a very successful career of never being called to account for them.
That said, where do you think he stands now on Iran? There's a carrier group that has moved from the South China Sea towards the Middle East. There are a number of reports, as you will know, from Washington coming out, seemingly well-sourced reports, suggesting that he has decided to join Israel in taking action against Iran. Where do you think he's going to come down on this?
Well, I'd distinguish between two separate questions, whether we take voluntary action militarily against Iran or whether we have to respond to something Iran does to us. On the question whether we voluntarily join Israel, which I think we should do, I don't think Trump has made up his mind yet. And I don't think he will because he still holds out the hope that the Iranians will start negotiating, which if I were in Tehran, I would certainly be advocating. Not that I would have any intention of ever honoring the agreements, but it's much better to talk, string things out, and avoid attack. He will be confronted within a number of days with the reality of having to make a decision one way or the other, but I can't project what he's going to do. It doesn't bother me because, as I say, he doesn't know what he's going to do. On the other hand, if Iran is foolish enough to attack American deployed forces in the region or civilian targets like our embassies and consulates or ramp up their campaign of terrorism in Europe and the United States, and we are damaged in some way, then I think Trump has no alternative but a massive response. And I would hope that he would feel the same way if the Iranians also mistakenly attacked the Gulf Arab countries, going after their oil infrastructure or whatever the targets might be. And I think that should produce a comparable response from the United States. That, I think, is much more certain.
You have observed him in decision-making action, as it were. Steve Bannon, who is a very prominent MAGA advocate, ideologue, he said last night, he said that if America joins Israel in attacking Iran's nuclear program, it would tear America apart. And other MAGA supporters have delivered this line. How much do you think does that sort of position impinge on Trump's thinking? Is it, when he's weighing a decision like this, is he weighing it in terms of the geopolitical risks, or is he thinking of the domestic political factors?
Mostly he's thinking about Donald Trump. And he wants to be center stage. And frankly, the past 48 hours have been wonderful for him, because what are we talking about? What is he going to decide? I've known Bannon for a long time. He's very bright. I think he's an astute observer of the American political scene, and he's trying to say to Trump, your base is going to be unhappy. But I think the bulk of the real MAGA Trumpers will support Trump if he decides to take military action. I think the threats of Tucker Carlson and some of these other nutcases are hollow. The MAGA base will stay loyal. But there is interesting evidence just out this morning in a Washington Post poll, and it's only one poll, but it shows why those who say that Trump has completely changed the Republican Party are wrong. This is a poll taken on should the U.S. support Israel and take military action at a time when Trump himself is obviously publicly undecided. Poll shows overall 25% are in favor of military action, 45% are against, 30% unsure, which I find a little surprising that it's so negative on the use of force. But here's the really interesting thing, which is the party breakdown. Democrats, 9% support the use of force. 67% oppose the use of force. 24% unsure. Republicans with Trump publicly unstated. Republicans, 47% support the use of force. 29% opposed, 24% unsure. That is the breakdown of the American parties before Donald Trump. Republicans taking a more assertive line, Democrats taking a more pacific line. And to me, that's confirmation that the Republican Party will not just survive Donald Trump, but we will move beyond him. If Trump decides to use force, the Republican support number will go to 75 or 80%.
Trump's relationship with Netanyahu is obviously very important for all this. In your memoir that you wrote after your time serving in the first Trump administration, I think you say something like that. On one occasion, you were asked, and you say Trump would back Bibi. Can you just explain the nature of their relationship, because this is obviously pivotal to where we are now?
Well, as they say on Facebook, it's complicated. Trump has a lot of support from evangelical Christians in the United States. And of all the different communities in the American electorate, the strongest, most pro-Israel community is the evangelical Christians. So he heard during the first term from Mike Pence, from David Friedman, our ambassador in Jerusalem, from a lot of us, why support for Israel was important to him politically. But at the end of the Trump administration, you could see strains in the relationship already. That Trump just didn't get along with Netanyahu as much as people thought. He was very upset that Netanyahu quickly called Joe Biden to congratulate him on winning the election, because, as we all know, Biden didn't win the election. Trump is jealous of Netanyahu because of all the politicians in the world, the one better at getting press attention is Netanyahu. And I think this grates on Trump. So right now, he sees Netanyahu as being at the head of the parade. And that's where Trump should be, in Trump's view of the world. And I think it's this has also shown the indecision in Trump's own mind. On Thursday night, when the Israeli attack started, Marco Rubio issued a statement that was notable in two respects. It said, this is a unilateral action by Israel, meaning no U.S. involvement, and there was no customary statement of support for Israel. Now, I don't know that Trump read it before Marco Rubio sent it out, but I'm sure he approved the substance of it. By the next morning, when it looked like things were going pretty well for the Israelis, Trump issued a statement of support for Israel. Later in the day, he said the results were excellent. Of course, I suppose that depends on what side you're on. And then later in the day, he said the stock market will go up because of the attacks, desperately crawling to get to the front of the parade. And now he wants to be on the winning side because Donald Trump is always a winner, as you all know. There are winners and losers in the world, and Trump is always a winner. He can't decide which side is going to win now. But he's coming to the point where he does have to make that decision. As the saying goes in the U.S., when you come to a fork in the road, take it. And that's what he's going to have to do.
How long has he got to make that decision, do you think?
I think it's a matter of days, because I think the Israelis are progressing at a relatively rapid rate in their efforts. We don't know for sure. We don't at least publicly know what the full extent of the damage they've caused. But and they do have the leisure of time. They've eradicated, as far as we can tell, Iranian air defense capabilities, so they can pick and choose. But I think there's a lot to do, and they're going to want to know whether and to what extent Trump is going to get involved.
You've been following this issue for a very long time and have long been an advocate for intervention against Iran's nuclear program. If America doesn't join Israel's campaign, can Israel take out the Fordo center complex without America, or are some of these reports that have been coming out true that it does that it does need America's bunker-busting bomb? I just ask you because I know that you've been looking at this for many years.
Yeah. Well, there certainly is a lot of information. I mean, the bunker busters will finish Fordo, and they will also conclusively finish Natanz. But Israel has capabilities. Just on Natanz, the International Atomic Energy Agency has reversed its initial assessment of the impact of the Israeli attack to say that they believe that the centrifuges deeply buried at Natanz may have been very substantially damaged. I don't think we know. Personally, I would say if Trump did get involved, I'd drop a few bunker busters on Natanz just to be sure that we're right. But what Israel can do at Fordo, which is buried under a mountain, is close the entry shafts and close the air shafts. And if you can't breathe, you can't enrich uranium. Now, that would require preventive maintenance every so many months to stop the Iranians from digging the entry tunnels open again. The problem, the risk here that we're not talking about is the potential that our intelligence is not perfect. That has happened from time to time, and that there are facilities that we don't know about that obviously we're not going to be destroying. The facilities that I worry about most are center around whether Iran has aspects of its nuclear program buried under a mountain in North Korea, of which I think there's a real possibility. So that's obviously out of question of reaching at this point.
And Russia's support for Iran, is that going to be a factor, or is Russia holding back, do you think?
I think Russia is overwhelmed with Ukraine. I don't think they can come to Iran's defense. They couldn't come to the defense effectively of the Assad regime when it was overthrown recently. I think the fact that Putin called Trump to wish him happy birthday, very nice way, wished him a happy birthday in a very nice way, because they're good friends and they have such a good personal relationship. And really, out of the goodness of his heart, to offer to mediate between Iran and Israel, that's about the limit of of Russian power here.
Ambassador, we are generous types at the Financial Times. I'm going to read you all a sentence from the Wall Street Journal. It's a column that appeared this week, in which near the end of it comes these two lines. The only lasting foundation for Middle East peace and security is overthrowing the Ayatollahs. America's declared objective should be just that. this was written by Ambassador Bolton, unfortunately not for us, but there you go. Ambassador, I mean, I think you could argue that it's one thing to take on Iran's nuclear program. It's obviously, or I would say, obviously, it's another thing to push for regime change. The world has seen how regime change ended in Iraq. It was pretty messy, and how it ended in Libya. Why are you so confident that regime change is the right thing to do?
Well, I'd encourage everybody to read the whole op-ed, which
fair enough.
lays all this out at somewhat greater length. But as I say in the piece, there's no question here about ground troops being involved. The fact is, the Ayatollahs are weaker than at any point since the revolution of 1979. Ever since 2018, 2019, they've had severe economic difficulties caused only in part by the sanctions, mostly caused by bad economic policy. You've got massive amounts of discontent really across the country. Young people, 60% of the population is under 30, know they could have a different life. They can see it across the Gulf. Among the ethnic minorities, Kurds, Azeris, Baluchis, Arabs, there's widespread discontent and a search for autonomy. Persians, depending on your estimate, are only 50 to 60% of the total population. With the murder 2 years ago of Masi Amini, a young Kurdish woman who was not wearing the hijab, and which provoked some of the most extensive demonstrations around the country under the Woman Freedom Life movement, you've got a challenge there that represented not just an objection to the dress code, but a fundamental assault on the legitimacy of the regime, because if the Ayatollahs do not speak the word of God on the dress code, they don't speak the word of God on anything. When you add all that together now with the pummeling that the terrorist surrogates like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis have taken with the fall of the Assad regime, a huge setback to Iran, and now the destruction of its ballistic missile production capabilities and the ongoing destruction of the nuclear program, all of this represents to Iran untold billions of dollars spent over decades lying in ashes now with no benefit whatever to the people of Iran. This is what ought to fragment the regime at the top and bring about the possibility of its downfall. It's far from certain, but the level of opposition inside the country, the weakness of the regime, the absence of a clear succession plan for the supreme leader who's 85 or 86 and sick, all indicate that it's very close to falling.
To be fair on the ambassador, he did also end by saying success is far from guaranteed, but the moment is auspicious. So I'm not going to read any more of our rivals' columns, but thank you for amplifying that. I appreciate, obviously, that, you know, the context, and I'm sure that many people, most people, possibly everyone in the room would agree that it's a pretty unattractive regime with a pretty dire record of, should we say, governance. But nonetheless, just to return to this, there is also, though, isn't there, a sort of huge risk that you end up with this regime overthrown and a country that tears itself apart and becomes a source of colossal instability for the region, and that absolutely outweighs the advantage of seeing the end of the regime.
Well, the risk of the country splitting is real. I think that's a possibility. The risk of the Ayatollahs being replaced by a military dictatorship is possible. But, you know, in 1979, at the time of the Islamic Revolution, Iran was approaching modernity. And that was one of the reasons the Shah was so vulnerable. So I think the population is well educated, it's sophisticated. You can't say for certain, but I think the worst case scenario is extremely unlikely. And in any event, the real question is, what is your tolerance of risk to have the kind of regime we have now have nuclear weapons? My tolerance is zero. And the only way that you achieve that objective is overthrow the regime.
I want to turn to another regime that you've been thinking about for some years, the one in Moscow, if I may. We heard some rather depressing insights into it last night via the conversation with Max and Michael. Maybe I should start by posing the very question that I think it was Mike Calvi suggested you should be answering, which is effectively what is it that shapes Trump's position on Putin? I mean, we saw just last week, this week, he was regretting the expulsion of Putin from the G8. How do you explain his seeming sympathy for Putin?
Well, it's in large part because of the way he sees international affairs. He sees it through the prism of personal relationships. He thinks he's friends with Putin. I don't think that's how Putin sees him. I first met Putin in October of 2001, right after 9/11. I accompanied Rumsfeld to Moscow for talks about what we were going to do in Afghanistan. And he struck me at the time, even though he'd only been president for a year or two, as one of the most cold-blooded individuals I'd ever met. I've met with him any number of times since then. My opinion hasn't changed. But Trump admires Putin as he admires other strong leaders. And he believes that if he has a good personal relationship, then the state-to-state relations between the U.S. and Russia are good. He thinks he's friends with Xi Jinping. He, after he met Kim Jong-un in Singapore for the first time, he said to the press, "We fell in love." That's how he sees things. That's not how they see things, but that's how he approaches it. And even in his comment on Russia being expelled from the G7, he put it that Putin was personally insulted that Russia had been expelled. It goes a little bit beyond that, but that's the lens that Trump sees it through. By contrast, if he has bad personal relations with a foreign leader like Zelensky, it's hard to see how you get good state-to-state relations. The implicit question is, all right, so look, is he a Russian agent or isn't he? I don't think so. I am his longest-serving national security advisor as of today, and may well be by the end of it, but I didn't see anything in 17 months that suggested that to me. I think rather he is what Vladimir Lenin once called a useful idiot.
On Zelensky, his dim view of Zelensky, does that all go back to the sort of conspiracy theories about Ukraine and Zelensky and Biden and all that sort of stuff?
Geez, you're so cynical. Ukraine campaigned against Trump in 2016. He believes this. He knows that Hillary Clinton's computer server is in Ukraine, and he still hasn't gotten it from Zelensky. And he remembers that the perfect phone call in the summer of 2019 led to his first impeachment. Now, I give Zelensky a lot of credit, particularly in the months since the humiliation in the Oval Office, for trying to develop a relationship with Trump. He has no other alternative, but I'm afraid for Ukraine that in Trump's mind, they're still out to get him.
So do you see any chance of Trump putting pressure on Putin? I mean, he's done this. He's had the same sort of back and forth over Russia in his public comments that he has recently over Iran. Any chance of Trump backing more sanctions on Russia, for example, or something more serious on Russia?
I think it's very unlikely. When we imposed sanctions on Russia in his first term, it was over him kicking and screaming, and we convinced him that he was basically required to do it. But I want to say a word here on sanctions because we're in the situation we are in Ukraine now, in part because neither the Biden administration nor the European Union had an effective strategy for military assistance or economic sanctions for 3 years, and that's left us with not very good alternatives. The EU is now considering what I have read to be the 18th package of sanctions since the Russian invasion in February of 2022. Why did it take this long to get 18 packages of sanctions? If one could imagine this level of sanctions, why didn't they occur the week after the invasion? When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, the Security Council imposed a universal sanctions ban on everything except food and humanitarian assistance, which were exceptions I thought were too broad at the time. and they were enforced. And what they proved was the sanctions weren't going to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. If you, and that's the most effective case for sanctions. If you imply sanctions a little bit, the target doesn't sit there and say, this is just terrible. The target evades the sanctions, the target mitigates the sanctions, target neutralizes the impact. Then you put another package of sanctions on, and they do the same thing. Wash and repeat 18 times. The sanctions have failed to stop the Russian, or even significantly impair the Russian military activity in Ukraine. I will say this about Woodrow Wilson. I can summon a few good words about him occasionally, because he is really the author of the modern doctrine of economic warfare through sanctions. And he said this is a form of warfare. And we, the West, do not administer it as a form of warfare. And to the extent we do not, it's not going to succeed.
So in the event of our failing to enforce economic sanctions as a form of warfare, how do you see the war unfolding then in Ukraine? It's pretty bleak.
Well, I'm pessimistic. I think the big unknown, and we have the NATO summit coming up in a few days, is what Trump will do in terms of permitting or endorsing additional U.S. military assistance to Ukraine. I think it's a pretty safe bet that for quite some time he's going to give up on the diplomatic front. It's been a failure. Everybody can see it. He doesn't want to revisit the failure. He wants to bring peace to the Middle East, or maybe war to the Middle East, whatever he's going to bring to the Middle East. But it doesn't tell you anything about the level of American assistance. Secretary of Defense Hegseth has testified to Congress it would come down. I don't think he has a clue what's on Trump's mind. But I think, because I'm doubtful that Europe can make up the difference if there were a zeroing out of American military assistance, it's obviously critical we find a way to keep it going. And not just what we conventionally think of, weapons, ammunition, and the like, but U.S. intelligence assistance, which I think is vital to the Ukrainians.
So you think that it's still in play then, American assistance, that it's not a given that it's done and it's going to be pulled out?
Right, but I think it would be helpful if Europeans and others were speaking to members of Congress and stressing why, perhaps in the next 6-7 days before the summit, it'd be nice to impress that on Trump.
NATO summit next week, as you say. How damaged is the transatlantic relationship, do you think?
Well, I think Trump has, by all of his actions, I mean, including tariffs and trade policy and diplomacy and geopolitical issues, has shredded decades of painful effort by Americans, sometimes successfully, sometimes less successfully, to build up relationships of trust, good faith, and the like, that are intangible and therefore unrecognizable by Trump. He doesn't care about them. He doesn't see the transaction cost of his behavior. He doesn't care about the feelings of uncertainty and betrayal, in some sense, that people here and in other parts of the world feel. I think Trump is an aberration in American politics. I don't see this repeating itself. I don't think there's a successor to Trump, because he has no philosophy to pass along. But there's a lot of damage that's been done, and it's important to try and repair it as we go, as it were, and try and forestall more of it. But it's however aggravating it is in Europe or elsewhere, we need to remember that during the Cold War, it was one of the Soviet Union's principal objectives to split the Western alliance, which they failed to do. It was one of the reasons they lost the Cold War. It would be tragic if, at a time when there are rising threats worldwide, we did their job for them.
You say Trump is an aberration. I find that very striking, because there's been an awful lot of commentary across the board suggesting that whatever you think of the president, that he marks as something of a sort of line in the sand in terms of America's role in the world, that effectively the U.S.-led global system, certainly the post-Cold War global system, is over, and whoever succeeds him, America will not resume full on the same role as before. You seem to think then that I may be wrong. Forgive me if I misinterpret you, but that America could return to playing a more sort of outward-facing role in the world after Trump?
Almost certainly will. And forgive me, but one of the problems with the media, of which there are many, is that they are.
Are you saying of which there are many problems or many media?
Both. The media is too quick to draw overbroad conclusions from insufficient data, and this notion of a line in the sand of that Trump has drawn is one of them. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, there was a huge threat of a return of American isolationism, primarily from the Democratic Party left. George McGovern's refrain in his acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention in 1972 was, "Come home, America. Come home, America." So that's what Tucker Carlson's saying. And we're going through phases of it. There's no doubt about it. It's inescapable. But it doesn't mean it's any more permanent than what happened at the end of Vietnam. After George H.W. Bush expelled Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, one of the things that he and many others said was a key consequence of that was that the Vietnam syndrome had finally been laid to rest. And so, there are cycles in politics, and we're going through a cycle now. America's had isolationist impulses for a long time, but it has never been the isolationist country, even in its infancy, that people said that it was. And I don't think it's going to be after Trump leaves either. In fact, depending on what Trump does in the next 7 or 8 days may show that we're not isolationist at all, and maybe even Trump is an isolationist.
And by the same token, then, do you think that the Republican Party can, at some stage, move on from the MAGA infection, the MAGA infusion, and that the Republican Party that you grew up in and whose administrations you worked for, while always a bit of an amalgam of different ideas and instincts and so on, you think that can actually return?
Well, I don't think the MAGA thing is an infection. I think what it's the last evidence of the collapse of working class support for the Democrats. That over a series of elections, Democrats have, Hillary Clinton called these people deplorables in the 2016 election. It turns out they don't like that. Really began with the Reagan Democrats in 1980, blue-collar workers who felt abandoned by the Democratic Party. And one of the reasons that I think Trump is so aberrational is that he ran against 3 of the worst possible candidates in 2016, 2020, and 2024. He was fortunate enough to beat Hillary the first time and Kamala Harris the second time, and Biden squeaked by in between. If the Democratic Party would get up off its back, which there's no sign of them doing in the past several months, then the Republican Party would have to look at the future too. And I think it's going to be, because Trump has no philosophy, he has no legacy.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor. So raise your hand, and we'll get you a mic as soon as possible. I see a hand here on the table in front of me.
Thank you. Miloš Brčko, Vattenfall. Mr. Ambassador, in March, when testifying in front of Congress, Tulsi Gabbard said, Iran is not developing nuclear weapons and Ayatollah hasn't authorized restart of the program. A couple of days ago, President said, I don't care what she said. Do you care what she said?
I think she's an idiot. She's not qualified for that job. She never should have been nominated. She never should have been confirmed. If Trump authorizes the use of military force, my dearest hope is that she will resign in protest.
Any other questions? I see a hand at the back there.
Very short question. What would be your advice to Europeans for their security policy?
Well, I think it's important to understand that as of tomorrow, Trump has only 43 months left. We will be over 10% of the way through his administration. He's still a new president, but remember, he's also a lame duck president. And every day that goes by, the lame duck aspect will become more important. If you thought the world were going to end in 43 months, then I would make very separate plans for European defense. But it's not going to end in 43 months. And I think as hard as it is, we've all got to grit our teeth to a certain extent and recognize that at the end of the 43 months, we will all be in a more secure position to the extent we can recreate the progress NATO was making. And contrary to some European leaders from Paris who said that the alliance was brain dead 3 or 4 years ago, we've now admitted Sweden and Finland, which many people thought wouldn't have happened at all. I think that European leaders should be careful, and again, I understand this is imposing on them, but they should be careful in how they characterize Trump. I think Chancellor Merz made a mistake, frankly, when he said he wanted German independence from the United States. I think Kaja Kallas made a mistake when she said we need a new leader of the West. I don't know who that would be, but I think they were both mistakes, because what they do, comments like that, give Donald Trump a permission slip to leave NATO. And he can say, well, we're not going to force ourselves on the Europeans. If they want to provide for their own defense, fine. If that's what you really want, go ahead and say you want independence, because he'll give it to you. That would be a mistake.
More hands at the back.
Norbert Röttgen from Germany. Do you see any political role to be played at all or better by the Europeans in the Middle East, and particularly regarding the imminent and current war that is ongoing?
Candidly, at the moment, no. I understand what we used to call the EU3, what I guess you now call the E3, are about to go off to try and negotiate with the Iranians. I don't think it will have any. I don't think it will have negative impact. I just don't think it will have any impact at all. So, I think the better thing, frankly, would be to get behind Chancellor Merz, so I can say a good word about him now, who said yesterday or the day before that Israel was doing the West dirty work here. He's exactly right. And the reality is Iran is not Israel's problem. Iran is our problem. Iran is a global proliferation threat. And we, for 25 years, have let them get away with it to the point where they verge on being a nuclear weapon state. We did the same thing with North Korea, and they've detonated 6 nuclear weapons. We have made this mistake before. We should not make it any longer. And that includes everybody that benefits from a world with fewer rogue states with nuclear weapons.
Hello, I'm Pierce Kirby from Martha's Vineyard. I was wondering about your view about the fact that NATO as a coalition might be in fact compromised by some of the former Warsaw-backed countries where Putin has gone in and made some investments in their energy companies, bought their energy companies.
They're politicians.
Correct. What's your view on that?
Well, I think it's one of the reasons why, by failing to force a strategic framework on NATO's assistance to Ukraine, we lost an opportunity to gain advantage over these voices like Orban and others that dissent from the idea that a Russian threat is something that the West should stand together on. I don't think we've lost the opportunity. I think we've had some pleasant surprises that a number of Eastern European leaders and some Western European leaders have done a lot better than we thought, and I think we just got to keep it up and not relent.
There's a hand there, I see, and then the gentleman with the baseball cap.
Thank you. My name is Ludwig van Rijt from the NVIDIA company. The Biden administration levied some of the strictest export limitations on certain technologies, semiconductors, and also related software. I would be interested in your views on the effectiveness of that going forward and what you might expect from the current administration.
Well, I think I will give my 30-second view on the trade issue. I mean, I think the Trump tariffs are insane. I think there are problems in the international trading order that could be fixed by negotiation. And I think there's one big problem in the international trading order that requires concerted international action, and that problem is China, which has been stealing our intellectual property for 4 or 5 decades, which subsidizes and protects its own companies, which has never really opened its own domestic market. And I think concerted action by the industrial democracies and any others who want to join us against China is the way to do it. But you don't go to a trade war by declaring war on everybody else, including your biggest trading partners. And this is giving China a free ride on a whole range of issues, including the continued theft of intellectual property, which is what sustains them. I'm not worried about China passing the West intellectually or technologically in that space. What I worry about is they copy us, and we don't protect our property, and we don't retaliate against them. But to do that, you need a united front. You don't need to be going to war with your major trading partners. This is just totally counterproductive.
Here in the middle.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm wondering whether you think exiting the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 has made Iran more or less of a nuclear threat in 2025?
Well, I think the 2015 deal itself made Iran more of a nuclear threat because the fatal mistake was to allow them any enrichment capability at all. When the EU3 began negotiating with Iran in 2003, their position was Iran can have a civil nuclear power program, but it must renounce any uranium enrichment and any reprocessing of plutonium from spent fuel, and that the fuel supply would be controlled by an international consortium. That was their consistent position. It was consistent when the Bush administration joined. It was consistent during the first 4 years of the Obama administration. And until John Kerry became Secretary of State and said, we're not going to get a deal with Iran unless we allow them to enrich, that position was given up. That doomed the deal from the beginning. And it was based in part on a misconception of what uranium enrichment to reactor-grade levels of U-235 meant. People say, but reactor-grade uranium is only 3 to 5% U-235, whereas weapons-grade uranium is 90% U-235. That's a big difference, they said. It is not. Enriching uranium from its U-235, from its levels in uranium in the ground to reactor-grade does 70% of the work, 70% of the work to get to weapons-grade. So every bit of enriched uranium at reactor grade could easily be enriched very quickly to weapons grade. Moreover, having a civil nuclear program gave Iran enormous opportunity for gaining total mastery of the nuclear fuel cycle. This was a way of them becoming a full nuclear power. The Gulf Arabs complained to the United States at the time, saying, when you license American nuclear technology, you require no uranium enrichment and no plutonium reprocessing. We, the Gulf Arabs, ask for your licenses, and you won't give them to us without those conditions. But you're giving it to Iran, and Iran took full advantage of it. And I think that's why we're suffering the consequences now. This is existential for Israel. It's a small country, 6-8 nuclear weapons. There isn't an Israel anymore. And it's existential for us because you take one nuclear warhead and put it on a tramp steamer and sail it into New York Harbor, and that's the end of Lower Manhattan. So I just want to say what I said before. What's your tolerance of risk for a nuclear weapons-capable Iran? Mine is 0.
Last question. Maybe second last.
Thank you very much. John Campner, I asked the question last night about Trump and Putin. Is it not the case that one of the reasons Trump admires Putin so much is his ability to stay in power for as long as he would like to, or for as long as he can survive, and to ride roughshod over constitutional norms such as they ever were in Russia. So therefore my question, which I'm sure you will dismiss out of hand, is I'm struck by how sanguine you appear to be about the durability of American democracy and the American constitutional settlement. You seem pretty convinced that Trump's only got 43 more months and then off he goes and everything returns back to normal and the grown-ups will be back in the room and democracy will be as strong as it ever was. Is that really your position?
100%. Look, we fought a civil war in the United States that killed 2% of the population, and we're still around. Trump will cause damage to the country. I've said it repeatedly, I'll say it again. But in the first term, he caused damage, and it's basically repairable. Some damage may not be repairable. If he withdraws from NATO, I don't know how we ever fix that again. But the American Constitution was not written for only good times. It was written by people who had seen the troubles with unfettered government as they saw it in those times, and written to constrain government. It's lasted a long time. We have the oldest written constitution continuously in use in the world. Not bad. And besides that, you have to look at the nature of the threat to the republic as it stands today. And I'll tell you, Donald Trump is no Catiline, he's no Sulla, he's no Pompey, he's sure as hell no Julius Caesar. We have withstood worse, and we will withstand Trump.
That's quite an answer to refer back to Catiline and Sulla and Pompey and Caesar, John. That should satisfy you. I'm just going to follow up on one thing you said in that answer, Ambassador, and I think then we'll have to draw to a close. You said if he withdraws from NATO, so you think that is still a possibility then?
Yes, I don't think he understands the nature of the NATO alliance. His basic perception is the United States defends Europe. We don't get anything out of it, and they don't pay for it. So I suppose if that's the way the alliance actually functioned, I'd probably be against NATO too. But that's not the way a successful collective defense alliance works. And I think if people understood in the United States better that the U.S. benefits the United States, we're not doing this out of the goodness of our hearts. We're not doing it because we're nice people, although we are. We're doing it because we are all more secure together, that's a better justification for the alliance than just saying we're a bunch of nice democracies. And I think the Western world as a whole has been harmed since the collapse of the Soviet Union by political leaders who are able to make the case that having a strong defense against these external threats is critical for protecting our societies and our economies at home, and that if we're not prepared to do it, then we will suffer the consequences. And that's something we need more of a debate of in the United States, and need more political leaders to make the case. I think the same is true in Europe.
Well, thank you very much. I suspect everyone in the room would agree with those remarks. I want to close by reading out a line that you wrote in your memoir. You said, I think, of Donald Trump's thinking, it's like an archipelago of dots, leaving the rest of us to discern or create policy. Well, in the last 45, 50 minutes, to slightly distend your metaphor, you've wonderfully taken us across this archipelago of dots of his worldview and the state of the world, and we're immensely grateful. Thank you very much for all your insights. I think we...
Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you.
This has been a bit of a whirlwind. I know you've had no breaks. One or two of you have slipped out for coffee, but we just felt it was good to keep it to a morning and keep it tight. So this is formally the end of the public session of the aforementioned first meeting of the FT Global Affairs and Business Council. And I hope that you have gained some insights into what's coming next in this turbulent world of ours, and just maybe how you navigate it. I also hope that you will join us shortly for a Chatham House Rules lunch where my colleague Ben Hall, the FT's Europe editor, who oversees all our coverage of Europe, and a bit more actually quite often, Ben, is going to have a conversation with Anne-Sylvaine Chassany, our Berlin bureau chief, and Henry Foy, our Brussels bureau chief, on Europe and European competitiveness, and whether this is a moment for Europe, whether this is indeed, as was once said over-optimistically, the hour of Europe. You can speak there privately, it's all off the record. If, so be, you found this stimulating, come to our next meeting in New York. We will also be holding, that's in September, we will also be holding one in London, and in Singapore later in the year. In New York at the Langen Hotel, we will of course return to Trump's transactional approach to the world. We will all be focusing on the future of the dollar as the world reserve currency and touching on the aforementioned Mar-a-Lago Accord, China and the US and much more. So you can head to the site. Finally, thank you Alex Partners and ServiceNow for backing us and making this possible. I think it's time for lunch.